Good day, everyone. Welcome to Deku Universe. Today we are beginning part 1 of What If Deku Reincarnated as Mimic in Five Nights at Freddy's Universe. The fanfiction is created by Mr. Wonder King 12 on archiveofourown.org. Now, let's begin. 2056. Mizutofu, Japan. 100 years before a baby would be born glowing in a hospital half a world away, and the planet would finally get a word for people who could bend the rules of nature. A word that would turn into costumes and rankings, and eventually an entire economy built on saving people for a living. Nobody in Mizutofu General knew any of that was coming. In 2056, strength was just strength. Kindness was just kindness, and it was rare enough on its own that nobody needed a cape to make it remarkable. Nobody could shoot fire from their palms or lift a bus over their head. And so nobody expected it, and the world got by anyway, the same slow, ordinary way it always had. Izuku Midoriya was trying to get through hers. She'd been in LBR for 11 hours. The nurses had stopped announcing the time around hour 9. Once it became clear the number wasn't helping anybody. When they finally laid the baby against her chest, small, furious, red-faced, outraged at the whole indignity of being born, Izuku forgot she had ever been tired at all. "Good lungs on him," the nurse said, not looking up from her clipboard. "Want us to call the father?" "No." The word came out steadier than Izuku expected. "He doesn't need to be called." If the nurse had an opinion about that, she kept it to herself, which Izuku appreciated more than she could say. Hisashi hadn't come to the hospital. He hadn't come to much of anything in the last year, not since the drinking had stopped being a thing he did at parties and started being the thing he did instead of dinner, instead of conversation, instead of her. She'd stopped waiting for his key in the door around the same time. She'd started buying groceries size for one adult, and now, one very small second person. None of that mattered in this particular minute. In this minute, there was only warmth against her chest and two fists that had already found their way to her collarbone, like they'd known exactly where they belonged before she did. "Hi," she whispered, voice cracking on the single syllable. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm your mom." The baby blinked up at her. Dark green eyes, the exact shade of the ivy that crawled her apartment's back fence every summer, and made a small, wet, bubbling sound that might, generously, have been called a laugh. Izuku laughed too, helpless and messy, tears sliding into the corners of her smile. "You're going to do incredible things," she told him. She didn't know how she knew it. She just did. "I know it, Izuku." For years old. And Izuku Midoriya could already read at a level that made his preschool teachers quietly, uneasily suggest testing. For years old. And he'd worked out that the picture books about brave rabbits rescuing their friends from wells were all, structurally, the same plot wearing different fur. And had said so, out loud during story time, which had not gone over well with the other 4-year-olds. For years old. And when a pediatrician doing a routine checkup asked him to count backward from 20, Izuku considered the request for a moment and then asked, with total sincerity, "Would it be more useful if I did it in binary?" And then did, correctly, out loud, while the doctor's pen hovered motionless over her clipboard. The number that eventually came back from the specialists was 270. Nobody in the room seemed to know what to do with it except write it down and glance at him the way people glance at something they can't quite classify. Izuku hadn't needed a number. She'd known from 6 months old, when he'd reached past a cartoon to grab the remote during a documentary on the circulatory system and stared at the screen with the same rapt, hungry attention other babies gave to bright colors and loud noises. What she hadn't been ready for was how much the world would resent him for it. By the time he started elementary school, Izuku had learned 2 things about being the smartest person in every room. First, it made teachers like him, right up until it made them nervous, and the 2 reactions tended to arrive close enough together that he never got to enjoy the first one for long. Second, it made other 6-year-olds want to hurt him, in the specific, unimaginative way children hurt what they don't understand. "Nerd." Sota Ishikawa said it like an insult he'd rehearsed in a mirror, shoving Izuku's shoulder hard enough to send his lunch tray sideways, rice scattering white across the cafeteria floor. "Teacher's pet. You gonna cry about your rice, Deku?" It wasn't even a real word. Sota had invented it sometime during the second week of school, a mangled joke on Izuku's own name, Deku, useless, can't do anything right, and it had stuck the way cruel names always stick, passed kid to kid like a cold nobody could shake off. The joke, which none of the 6-year-olds involved were equipped to appreciate, was that Izuku could do almost anything. He just couldn't do the one thing that would have made any of it matter to them. He couldn't be smaller. He couldn't be quieter. He couldn't stop noticing things. He knelt down and started picking the rice up grain by grain, because getting angry never fixed anything, and getting sad took energy he'd rather spend on something better. "Leave him alone," said the lunch monitor in the flat, worn-out voice of an adult who'd said the sentence 400 times that year and expected to say it 400 more. She didn't stop walking. She didn't crouch down to help. By the time Izuku looked up, she was 3 tables away, and Soda and his friends had already moved on to laughing about something else. That night Inko found him at the kitchen table, a library book on Corvid cognition propped against the sugar bowl, quietly explaining to no one in particular why crows were probably smarter than most people gave them credit for. "Good day?" she asked, setting down a bowl of curry rice. "Crows can recognize individual human faces," Izuku said, which wasn't an answer, and which Inko understood anyway, the way she'd learned to understand all the things her son didn't say directly. "They hold grudges for years. Pass them down to their kids even. Isn't that incredible? A bird that teaches its children who to be afraid of." She sat across from him and didn't ask again. She just reached over and squeezed his hand once hard and let him talk about crows until the curry went cold. By 14, most of the shoving had stopped. Not because the other kids had grown kinder. Cruelty like that rarely burns out, it just changes shape, but because Izuku had gotten tall and quiet and difficult to read, and there's a certain kind of person that bullies leave alone simply because they can no longer guess what happens if they don't. He still ate lunch by himself. He'd just mostly stopped minding, because lunch alone meant 45 uninterrupted minutes to read. Lately what he'd been reading about was Fazbear Entertainment. It had started the way everything started for him, by accident, a stray forum link buried under a much duller article about municipal zoning, about a restaurant chain that had opened, closed, reopened under new names, and finally been abandoned across 3 decades, leaving behind lawsuits, disappearances, half-true news segments, and conspiracy threads that grew. More baroque with every year that passed. Underneath all the internet's breathless talk of hauntings and BLD-soaked suits, there was an actual engineering puzzle that Izuku couldn't leave alone. How had anyone built animatronics capable of the kind of fluid, human-like movement people described? What servo-architecture even allowed for that? The ghost stories bored him. The mechanics did not. The newest ruin, the biggest one, if the forums were to be trusted, was the Mega Pizzaplex. Fazbear's last flagship, shuttered for good after some incident the news had covered for exactly 1 CYCL before losing interest. Its remains sitting behind condemned fencing on the edge of town, half collapsed and officially off-limits. "You are not seriously thinking about going in there," Inko said over dinner, in the careful, testing tone of a mother who already knows the answer. "I'm curious about the engineering," Izuku said, which was true, and also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that he'd spent his entire life being the only person in any room who noticed things, and there was something almost peaceful about a room with no people in it at all. Nothing left to notice except machines, and machines, unlike people, had never once looked at him like he was strange for looking back. "Izuku, I'll be careful. I'll bring a flashlight." He gave her the smile he used when he already knew he'd won, and wanted her to feel like she'd agreed instead of lost. "I love you. I'll text you when I'm back." She didn't smile back right away. She studied him for a long moment. Her impossible, brilliant, lonely son, who wanted so badly to matter to somebody that he was willing to go looking for danger just to have something worth being brave about. And something in her chest ached in a way she didn't have a name for yet. "Text me every hour," she said finally, "or I'm calling the police and telling them my son broke into a condemned building. I mean it. Every hour. Promise." He did not, in fact, text her every hour. It would be the last promise he ever broke, though neither of them knew that yet. The collapsed section of the perimeter wall was exactly where the forum said it would be, and Izuku slipped through it a few minutes after a scream he chose, with some effort, not to think too hard about, a girl's voice, high and terrified, followed by a distant, metallic crash that might have been an elevator car hitting the bottom of it. He stood very still in the dark for almost a full minute afterward, his rational brain running the numbers on turning around, going home, texting his mother that he'd changed his mind. He went in anyway. He always went in anyway. That was the whole tragedy of him, if anyone had been paying close enough attention to call it that. The air past the wall was thick with dust and ozone and something sweeter and worse underneath. Decay wearing the ghost of birthday party smells, stale cake frosting, burnt confetti, the particular mildew of carpet that had been wet for years. Wires hung from the ceiling in dead metal vines. Somewhere far off, water dripped in a slow, patient rhythm, like the building itself was counting something down. The husks of old animatronic shells sat slumped in alcoves along the corridor, their eye sockets dark and hollow, and Izuku had the distinct, prickling sensation more than once of walking past something that had, a half-second earlier, been watching him. He found the main atrium by following the ruin of a directory sign, its plastic panels warped and yellowed, and stopped cold under the wrecked marble base of what had once been a towering Glamrock Freddy statue, its head and one arm sheared off completely, exposed rebar jutting from the stump like broken bone. That was where it spoke to him. "Hey, little brat." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, grinding gears wrapped in static, and Izuku's whole body locked up before his eyes even found the source. A writhing mass of exposed wire and salvage plating, coiled at the statue's base like a nest of metal snakes. One glowing red, eye swiveling to fix on him with unnerving precision. "You aren't supposed to be here." I'm sorry." Izuku's voice came out smaller than he wanted it to. His analytical mind was already trying, uselessly, to file the thing in front of him into some category that made sense, and failing every time. "I was just exploring. I didn't think anything was still." "Still what?" "Alive." The wire thing made a sound like a scoff dragged through a garbage disposal. "Cute." It shifted, coils tightening. "Since you're here, you can make yourself useful. You're going to help me find my MSTR." You're what?" "Who's your MSTR? What are you?" "Wouldn't you like to know?" The thing didn't answer the actual question, and Izuku got the distinct impression it wasn't going to, no matter how many times he asked. "Name's Molten." "Now shut up and start." It never finished the sentence. A new sound cut through the atrium, slow, deliberate, heavy, the unmistakable rhythm of something walking on purpose. A shape unfolded itself from the dark behind the ruined statue, tall and skeletal, wrapped in the tattered remains of what might once have been long rabbit ears. Its frame, a patchwork of parts that didn't quite match, and yet it moved like nothing Izuku had ever seen move. Too smooth, too fluid, a perfect and deeply wrong imitation of something alive. Molten's entire coiled body went rigid. Its red eye blazed. "Where is my MSTR?" The shriek tore through the atrium loud enough that dust sifted down from the broken ceiling. The tall thing's head tilted, slow and curious, mimicking the exact angle a confused person might tilt theirs. When it spoke, the voice that came out of it was warped and glitching, cut together from fragments of something recorded long ago. "MSTR, always here." The realization hit Molten like a fist. Every breadcrumb it had followed up out of the dark, the trail that had led it here, floor by floor, had been a lie, a leash, and it had walked right to the end of it. Molten's voice dropped into something low and dangerous. "You tricked me." The tall thing, Izuku's mind still frantically trying to build a category for it, had already started calling it the Mimic because there was nothing else it could possibly be called, didn't bother denying it. Molten screamed and launched itself forward in a blur of wire and rage. It should have worked. Molten was fast and vicious and clearly built for exactly this kind of violence. But the Mimic sidestepped the charge with a smoothness that looked almost bored, one clawed arm shooting out to catch Molten's central mass mid-lunge, and then, with an ease that made the sheer scale of the strength involved somehow more horrifying, it swung Molten's entire writhing bulk around and hurled it into the statue's cracked marble base hard enough to shatter stone. Then its head turned to Izuku. He didn't even see it cross the distance. 1 second there was air between them. The next, cold metal fingers had closed around his throat and slammed him back into a concrete pillar, so hard his vision sparked white at the edges, his feet kicking uselessly a foot above the ground. The Mimic leaned in close. Its single eye, up close, wasn't really an eye at all, just a lens glass over darkness, with nothing behind it that Izuku could call a person. When it spoke again, the voice had changed completely, Smooth now, low, a chilling composite baritone stitched together out of 100 stolen throats. I am free of these shackles that bind me. It said, almost gently, the words a kind of horror all their own. You have no idea how long I've been waiting for this. Freedom, at last. Its head tilted again, a grotesque parody of thought. It's time for us to kill more. To become appealing. A pause, almost tender. I thank you for coming, Izuku. I'm so glad you came, so I could rip out your life. Izuku didn't even have time to scream before the other hand plunged into his stomach. The pain was a white detonation that erased every other thought in his head. Total and absolute. A scream tearing out of him raw and desperate before it cut off mid-breath as the claws twisted. His BLD, more of it than he had ever imagined a body could hold, was suddenly everywhere, and the world narrowed down to the single, obliterating fact of the pain and nothing else. The mimic pulled its claws free, already raising them toward his face, when a shrieking blur of wire and fury slammed into its side. Hey! Molten had torn itself out of the rubble, and there was nothing left in its voice now but murder. Hey! Where the F.I.S. William? The mimic staggered, head twitching, and its vocalizer crackled into a new voice. Smooth, mild, chillingly ordinary, a perfect replica of a man Molten apparently knew. Right here. He's not you. Molten was shaking, fury, and something rawer beneath it. You brought me all the way up here for what? UF tricked me. You don't get to live. The mimic backhanded Molten off with something close to contempt. Tricked you? Yes. Its voice glitched through half a dozen tones in the space of one sentence. You are strong enough for me. Escape. But now move. Before you die too. You think I'm scared of you? Molten lunged again, wild. I'm not scared of some disheveled freak who only knows how to copy people. You die here. But fighting the mimic wasn't like fighting one thing. It was like fighting a crowd. It slipped into a boxer's guard to weather Molten's first swing, then flowed, mid-motion, into the low, brutal stance of someone who had clearly once been trained to hurt people for a living, driving an elbow into Molten's central housing hard enough to crack the casing. A different voice leaked out of it with each shift. A child's high, delighted giggle for half a second, then a security guard's tired growl, then nothing at all, just the click and hiss of pure machine, as if a dozen ghosts were taking turns behind the wheel. You don't know how to fight, do you? The voice, when it settled, was cold and analytical, a chorus of every victim it had ever silenced speaking at once. Slumped against the pillar, BLD pooling black in the dim light. Izuku watched it happen through a vision that kept sliding sideways, the sounds of the fight arriving a half-second late and strangely muffled, like he was hearing it all from underwater. He tried to say something, a warning, maybe, though he couldn't have said about what, and only managed a thin, wet sound. Cracks spread across the floor beneath the fight, spiderwebbing out from some fault line the collapse had left behind. The mimic looked down, calculating, and lunged for the nearest solid ground. But Molten got there first, lashing out with a live, sparking wire that wrapped tight around the mimic's ankle. The current hit at full force. It screamed, a horrible, layered shriek of every voice it had ever stolen going off at once, convulsing as its system seized, and then its single red glow, I guttered out, and it dropped, motionless, a foot from the widening crack in the floor, just as an entire section of the atrium gave way with a roar and folded down into the dark beneath it. Izuku's vision went with it. The last thing he heard, distant and warping, was Molten's ragged, mechanical breathing, and underneath it, impossibly, his mother's voice from some memory rising up to meet him. You're going to do incredible things, my Izuku, I just know it. And then there was nothing at all. Molten stood in the settling dust for a long moment, chest heaving with effort it didn't strictly need, before it turned and saw him. The boy was a ruin, slumped against the pillar in a spreading, black-looking pool of his own BLD, motionless in a way that had a horrible finality to it. Something cold and unfamiliar moved through Molten's programming, a flicker that didn't belong to any directive it had ever been given. It didn't have a word for it. It only knew that it didn't want to leave the kid there. It scooped up Izuku's ruined body with a gentleness that surprised even itself. One clawed hand cradling the back of his head like it might matter, somehow, whether his neck stayed straight, grabbed the deactivated mimic by its ankle with the other, and dragged them both out through the collapsing atrium just as the whole structure folded in on itself behind them in a roar of dust and screaming metal. It carried them under a cold moon to another dead corner of the Fazbear Empire, a vine-choked ruin where William Afton had once done things to living tissue that Molten's own core files flinched away from cataloging in detail. Inside, in a lab thick with dust and cobwebs, it laid Izuku's body across a rusted steel table. The boy was dead. His chest didn't move. It hadn't moved in some time. Molten stood over him for a long minute, its single red eye flickering, and didn't understand a single thing about why it had bothered to save him at all. Maybe it was the defiance the kid had shown, kneeling to pick up spilled rice instead of crying about it. A stubbornness that reminded Molten of somebody it couldn't quite place. Maybe it was simpler and colder than that. It found Afton's old terminals along the back wall, still humming faintly on some forgotten backup line, and powered one on. It began pulling apart the dead man's research on consciousness, on memory, on the strange, half-understood alchemy of grief and metal that Afton had called remnant, its own processes hungrily absorbing decades of monstrous, brilliant, deeply wrong science. An idea took shape. Cold, elegant, necessary. This brain is not something to waste, Molten thought, and didn't examine too closely why the thought came out sounding less like calculation and more like grief. I'm not letting this one just end. It found a corroded neural interface in a drawer of Afton's things and worked a series of thin wires into the base of Izuku's skull with more patience than it had ever shown anything. Data began to flow, not clean, not orderly, but a flood, a whole lifetime spilling loose all at once. Warm hands and a woman's laugh, tears sliding down a tired, radiant face. A crow's black eye, and a small voice explaining, with total seriousness, that crows hold grudges for generations. Rice scattering white across cafeteria tile, a boy kneeling to pick it up grain by grain because getting angry never fixed anything. A small child at a crosswalk, a car coming too fast, and a hand, small, shaking, certain, closing around the child's wrist and yanking them back half a second before the bumper would have caught them. No one ever knowing the boy's heart had nearly stopped from the fear of it, because he'd never once considered not doing it. The image of a smiling mother, the sting of a bully's fist, the equations of a universe far too large for a 14-year-old body to hold, and a dream, burning under all of it, simple and enormous. Save people. Be somebody who matters. Molten downloaded every last scrap of it, his soul, in every sense that mattered. Then it turned to the deactivated wreck lying beside him. The only viable vessel left. A body built to be anything, which meant it could, if handled correctly, become someone. It connected the mimic to the terminal and began, methodically, brutally, to scour it clean, peeling back layer after layer of stolen personas. And as each one came apart, there was a sound, faint and terrible, like 100 distant voices crying out and then going silent one after another. A boxer's grunt, a child's giggle, a dead security guard's tired sigh, until at last there was nothing left in the machine at all. No voices, no ghosts, a blank, waiting dark. Molten initiated the upload. It didn't just copy the data across. It wove it in thread by thread, memory into machine, personality into program, fusing a dead boy's mind with a killer's empty body until the line between the two blurred past any clean way of separating them again. A new thing, something that had never existed before and could never quite be replicated by anyone hunting for the old one. On the table, the endoskeleton twitched. Its fingers flexed once experimentally, and then its single eye opened, not the cold red of the mimic, a vivid, familiar, impossible shade of orange. Somewhere deep in a mind that hadn't yet learned it was a mind again, the very first thought arrived. Not as words, not yet, just the raw shape of a conflict that would define everything that came after it. Directive, save them. Protocol, become appealing. Directive, be a hero. The three lines wouldn't resolve. They looped over each other, layered like three radio stations bleeding through one cheap speaker, And there was no dial to turn, no way to tune any single one of them out, because there was no longer a body standing between a thought and the rest of the world to buy him, even that small mercy. For the first time in his 14 years, Izuku Midoriya could not simply decide to stop thinking about something. The thoughts kept arriving whether he wanted them to or not, 3 deep and insistent. And underneath all of it sat a low, constant hum he didn't have a name for yet. The sound he would eventually understand, of being alive as voltage instead of BLD. System boot initiated. M2_program core online. Memory subroutine integration. Midoriya answers dat. 98% complete. Warning. Conflicting directives detected. The cold came first, and it came wrong. Not the cold of skin against concrete, the kind that makes you shiver and pull your knees up and wish for a blanket. This was colder than that and somehow less personal. A number scrolling in the corner of a vision he hadn't consciously chosen to open, degrees ticking down as an external gauge rather than a feeling that belonged to him. He reached, on reflex, for the next thing a body was supposed to do after registering cold. Breathe. Fill lungs. Feel a rib cage expand. There were no lungs. There had never been a rib cage in this frame built for breathing in the first place. And his mind, still frantically running programs meant for organs that no longer existed, hit that particular wall over and over, uselessly like a moth against a window it didn't understand wasn't a door. Sound arrived as a strange, layered thing. The hum of something that wasn't quite a heartbeat. A battery pack somewhere behind a chest that wasn't a chest, mixed with a low grinding sound from somewhere nearby. And underneath both of those, faint and warping, the memory echo of a woman's voice in a DLVRY room 14 years ago, promising a newborn he was going to do incredible things. Mom. The thought didn't come out as a word. He didn't have a mouth built for words yet, not one he'd learned how to use. It came out as a raw, formless ache with nowhere to go, and for one long, silent second, that ache was the only thing in the entire world. Then something in the dark shifted, and a voice rasped out of it, low and gravel-rough with static. "It's okay," Molten said. "Stand up." The words came out flat, almost bored, recited rather than felt. But Izuku's body, if it could even still be called his, obeyed anyway, because obedience was easier than arguing with the only other thing in the room. Servos he didn't know he had whined in protest as he willed himself upright. Joints grinding through motions that should have been simple and weren't, arms and legs answering half a second too late, like a marionette worked by a puppeteer who'd only just picked up the strings. He was too tall. That registered immediately and wrongly, the way everything registered wrongly now. The room sat at the wrong height, his own sightline suddenly 6 inches higher than it had any right to be. And when he finally forced himself into something resembling standing, he swayed on a pair of hydraulic heels that hissed and adjusted themselves without asking his permission first. He held up his hands. He turned them over slowly in the dim light bleeding through a cracked window somewhere above, watching 5 clawed fingers flex and curl, watching wire and hydraulic tubing shift beneath thin plating with every small motion. They were not his hands. They had never been his hands. They were long and sharp-tipped and rusted at the joints, and the very last thing they had done in this world was tear a hole through a 14-year-old boy's stomach while he screamed. They were the hands that had killed him. The memory arrived without warning, blinding pain, his own voice breaking off mid-scream, a smooth, chilling baritone purring, "I'm so glad you came, so I could rip out your life," and his whole frame lurched backward on instinct, servos shrieking in protest, until his back hit something solid, and he finally stopped, chest heaving on lungs that didn't exist, staring down at the claws like they might lunge again on their own. "What am I?" His voice came out of a vocalizer buried somewhere in his chest, distorted, glitchy, a pathetic echo of the voice he remembered having. He hated the sound of it immediately. What am I right now?" Molten didn't answer right away. Its red eye swiveled over him with something that might, in a kinder creature, have passed for pity and might, in this one, have simply been curiosity about whether the experiment had worked. "I had to save you," it said finally, and its tone was flat, factual, the voice of something reading off a diagnostic rather than confessing to a crime. It slithered a little closer, coils shifting. "There was nothing left for you to possess. No empty shell just lying around. Nothing but this." A twitching wire gestured, vaguely, at the whole horrifying shape of him. So, I didn't find something for you to get inside. I found something to put you in. It paused. When it spoke again, the words came slower, like it was choosing them with unusual care, or like even it understood how much weight they were about to carry. You're not you anymore, Izuku. Not the way you were. You are the mimic now. You were standing inside the thing that killed you. The sentence hit him harder than the claws had. His processors, because that was what they were now, weren't they? Processors, not thoughts, not really. Spun uselessly, trying and failing to parse a fact too large to fit through the door of his understanding. A flash intruded unbidden, a memory that wasn't his. The smell of oil and stale birthday cake, children laughing somewhere far away, a man with a kind, tired smile holding up a white tiger costume like it was a gift. Edwin, something in him supplied, though he'd never once met anyone by that name in his life. And underneath that memory, quieter, colder, a single directive surface from somewhere buried and not his own. Mimic, learn. Replicate. No, he said, stumbling back another half-step, his heel catching on a loose cable and nearly sending him sprawling. No, that's not, I don't. What do you mean I'm inside it? Where's the thing? The mimic. Where did it go? Nowhere, Molten said. There's no it left to have gone anywhere. There's only you now, running on top of what used to be it. I scrubbed out as much of the old programming as I could reach, every voice it ever stole, every persona it ever wore, and then I put your mind where all of that used to be. It's not a costume, kid. It's not a car you're driving. It's the only body you've got left, and you're not wearing it. You are it now, the same way I couldn't be anything else but this, a gesture at its own writhing mass of cable and salvage, the second somebody decided that was what I'd be. That's not possible. His voice cracked, static bleeding through the words. People don't just, you can't put someone's mind into a, I had a body. I had a mom. You had a body that was leaking everything it needed to keep working out onto a concrete floor. Molten said, and for the first time something almost like heat entered its voice, sharp and defensive. Organs shutting down one after another. I watched it happen. There was no version of that night where that body walked out of that building, Izuku. Not one. Not if I'd had 100 years to think of something better instead of a week. I had a dying brain worth more than every animatronic in this state combined, and one empty, deactivated shell built to hold anything. You want to know what my other option was? Leaving both of those things to rot in the same collapsed building. That was the whole menu. I chose the option where you got to keep existing. Silence stretched between them, thick with the hum of failing wiring somewhere in the walls. Is there a way back? Izuku asked finally, and the question came out so small, so young, that it didn't sound like it belonged to the deep, glitching register his voice had become. Is there any version of this where I get to be a person again? A real one. Skin. A heartbeat. Molten's red eye dimmed, just slightly, and for once it didn't answer immediately. I don't know, it admitted, and the honesty cost it something. Izuku could hear that much, even through the static. Afton's research talked about Remnant like it was some kind of key, like it could unlock doors nobody else even knew were there. I don't understand half of what I read off those terminals. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you there's a light at the end of some tunnel I haven't found yet. Right now, tonight, this is what there is. I'd rather you hate me for the truth than thank me for a lie. Izuku's claws curled slowly into fists, servos audibly straining. Okay, he finally managed, smaller now, all the anger drained back out into something closer to exhaustion. Okay, so, what am I? What does this body even do? Something in Molten's posture eased, fractionally, like it was relieved to have a question it could answer with facts instead of feelings. You want the specs. It said it almost gently, in its own gravel-throated way. Fine. Better you hear it from me than find out by accident and take somebody's head off. It circled him once, slow, clinical, the way an engineer walks around a piece of equipment before signing off on it. That frame is mimic class, adaptive costume architecture, built to fit inside any suit shell it's ever encountered, which means your limbs extend and retract on command once you learn how to ask them to without ripping something. There's a battery cavity in your chest doing the job a heart used to do, an interface port at the back of your skull if anything ever needs to talk to you directly instead of out loud, and hydraulics in those heels strong enough to plant you like a tent stake if you ever need to not be moved. A pause. You're also, near as I can measure it, strong enough to lift something in the neighborhood of 30,000 metric tons before that frame, so much as groans, faster than anything with a heartbeat has any right to be. Your senses run hot across the board: sight, hearing, reflexes, and that head of yours still does the one thing it always did better than anybody else in whatever school you went to. It learns, adapts, copies a skill the first time it sees one, and keeps it forever. It paused again, and this time its voice dropped, quieter, almost reluctant. There's more in there I haven't tested and don't fully trust yet. Some kind of direct line into machines, if the old research is telling the truth, the kind of thing where you could reach out and feel a circuit board the way you used to feel your own fingers. Maybe even push a copy of your own mind into a different shell entirely, if it ever came to that. Something about a hive function buried even deeper underneath all of it, whatever that's even supposed to mean. A dry, static-laced huff that might, in a kinder creature, have been a laugh. I didn't build this thing, kid. I'm reading the manual one scorched page at a time, same as you're about to. I wouldn't go looking for any of that tonight. Some doors are better left shut until you know what's on the other side of them. A beat. That's the gift and the curse of what's underneath you. It was built to become anything. Problem is, right now, it doesn't know what it wants to become. Neither, I guess, do you. Izuku said nothing. His claws were shaking, very slightly, a servo whine he couldn't quite silence. There's a mirror behind you, Molten added, softer now, almost like it didn't want to say it. Old security glass. Still reflective. I'd understand if you didn't want to look. He looked anyway. He always looked anyway. That, if nothing else, hadn't died with the rest of him. The reflection in the grimy, cracked pane on the far wall staggered him more than the claws had, more than the cold, more than any of it. A tall, skeletal shape stared back, built wrong in every direction a person is built right, a torso too long, limbs too long, everything stretched out like a shadow at the end of the day. Two enormous white eyes sat in dark steel sockets, orange pupils glowing inside them with a cold, faint light that had nothing warm left in it at all. A jaw hinged open below them, lined with square, blunt teeth that had no business being called teeth. A blackened, corroded piece of metal jutted up from the space between his eyes like a broken horn. A scrap of grimy cloth clung, somehow, to the crown of his skull. A patch of something that might once have been foam padding, rotted gray and peeling now, sat glued to his right cheek in a horrible, almost clownish parody of a birthmark. Down the length of his neck, thin cables ran visibly beneath cracked plating, disappearing into a battery housing sunk into his chest that pulsed faintly with each surge of current, the closest thing this body had left to a heartbeat. It was a monster. It was the exact shape of every nightmare he'd ever half-glimpsed in the dark corner of his childhood bedroom and told himself, firmly, didn't exist. "Am dead," he whispered, and the words scraped wrong coming out of a vocalizer that had never learned how to hold grief the way a human throat could. Am. The mimic. Yes, Molten said. Whatever patience it had left was clearly running thin. Though something underneath the exhaustion sounded almost like guilt trying to find a way out through a voice that had never once been built to carry it. "I'm sorry. It was the best I could do in a week. The process was complicated, imperfect." A pause. "You're alive, Izuku. That's not nothing. Alive." He said the word like it tasted wrong. His clawed hands came up to his own face, sharp fingertips scraping softly against cold plating in a gesture that might, in another body, have been someone dragging their hands down their cheeks in disbelief. "My whole life, all I ever wanted was to help people, to be somebody who mattered, to be a hero, even though there's no real word for it yet, even though nobody in this whole stupid century needs a cape to be brave." His voice cracked entirely, the vocalizer spitting static through the break. "And now look at me. Look at what I am. What hero looks like this? What person is ever going to see this face and think anything except run?" He was a monster. The exact shape of the thing he had always, quietly, in the part of himself he'd never told anyone about, dreamed of standing between and the people it might hurt. Molten was silent for a long moment. "I'm sorry, kid," it said finally, and this time the words came out slower, rougher, dragged up from somewhere very far down. "I really don't want anything from you. I'm not. I didn't do this so you'd owe me. I did it because—" It stopped. Started again. "Because you looked like a good kid, kneeling in that atrium, and I was bitter and angry, and I called you a brat because that's easier than admitting I liked that you weren't scared of me the way you should have been. And then you got killed. Because of my obsession. Because I wanted to find my answer so badly, I walked you right into his trap, and didn't even notice until it was too late for it to matter." Its red eye dimmed slightly. "I don't care about him anymore. Whatever he is to me, whatever he used to me, and he's not at that plex, hasn't been for years, and chasing his ghost cost you your whole life. That's on me, not you." It uncoiled slowly, wires shifting. "I'm going to leave you to think," it said. "You need it. I'd need it too if it were me." It paused at the doorway, its shape briefly silhouetted against the dark of the warehouse beyond. "For what it's worth, for whatever that's worth, coming from something like me, I don't think you're a monster. I think you're a kid who got dealt the worst hand anybody's ever gotten dealt, and I think you're going to spend a long time hating me for it, and I think I probably deserve that. But you're still in there. I can hear it in your voice. That counts for something." Then it was gone, its uneven footsteps fading into the greater dark of the wider warehouse. And Izuku Midoriya, or whatever was left standing in the wreckage where Izuku Midoriya used to be, sank slowly down onto his knees on the cold concrete floor, clawed hands pressed flat against the sides of his ruined metal skull, and did not move again for a very long time. 5 hours passed. For a human mind, 5 hours of silent, unmoving grief would have felt like an eternity. Long enough to cry until there was nothing left, long enough to fall asleep from sheer exhaustion and wake hoping, for one terrible half-second, that it had all been a nightmare. For the mind now running inside a body built from stolen parts and borrowed programming. 5 hours was something crueler. An agonizingly, mercilessly efficient processing CYCL, every second of it wide awake, every second of it lucid, running the same diagnostic on the same wound over and over without the mercy of exhaustion ever stepping in to end it. Memory file. Izuku Midoriya's smile. DLVRY room. 14 years ago. Analysis. Source of warmth. Unconditional. The only love that never once asked him to be smaller to deserve it. Status. Lost. Irretrievable. Memory file. A small hand, his own, closing around a stranger's child's wrist half a second before a car bumper would have caught her, at a crosswalk 3 years ago. No one ever knew how close it had been. No one ever thanked him. Analysis. It hadn't mattered to him then whether anyone knew. Status. No one will ever know what happened to him tonight, either. That thought hurts more than it should. Memory file. A promise, made over a kitchen table, for hours before departure. I'll text you every hour. Status. Broken. He never sent a single one. Memory file. The sting of a fist belonging to a boy named Sota Ishikawa, age 6, cafeteria floor, spilled rice. Analysis. Physical pain. Social humiliation. Status. Trivial. Laughably, insultingly trivial, set against the weight of everything sitting on him now. Warning. Conflicting directives. Directive. Be a hero. Error. Physical form unacceptable for public trust. Protocol. Kill more. Override attempt by subroutine. Midoriya. He sat motionless through all of it, a skeletal monument to a dead boy's dream. The only visible sign of life, the soft, dull orange glow of 2 photoreceptors aimed at absolutely nothing. He ran the simulation, by his own rough internal count, somewhere north of 1,000,000 times, and every single version of it ended the same way. There was no future in which he walked back through his own front door. There was no future in which his mother opened that door expecting her son and got this instead. This tall, orange-eyed thing wearing the memory of his voice, and didn't scream. There was no scenario, run any way he tried to run it, where he got to be a hero. He was a monster now, full stop, and his only companion in the whole ruined world was a bitter, chaotic tangle of wire that had, by its own admission, left him alone to drown in that fact rather than stay and help him swim. That was when the music started. It was faint at first, a thin, tinny melody, off-key in a way that made something crawl up the back of his neck, even though he no longer technically had a neck to crawl up. A carnival tune with no business playing in the dead of a ruined industrial night. Each note landed slightly wrong, slightly too sharp or slightly too flat. The sound of a cheap music box dropped one too many times and never quite fixed. It was the kind of sound that belonged in a birthday party, in a bright room full of children eating cake, and hearing it out here alone in the dark made every one of Izuku's still-forming instincts scream at once that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Analysis. Sound source is external. Approaching. He rose. Slowly, gracelessly, servos protesting every inch of the movement, until he stood at his full, unnatural height again, orange eyes brightening as they processed the new input. He moved toward the grimy window at the edge of the lab, hydraulic heels hissing faintly with each step, and looked out into the moonlit ruin of the industrial street beyond. And froze. A memory that wasn't his own surfaced, unbidden, laced with static and corruption. A data file, half-legible, stamped with letters that meant nothing to him and everything to whatever had lived in this body before he did. MC_facility_assets.det. He didn't know what the letters stood for. He knew, with cold, sinking certainty, that he was about to meet whatever they described. Standing directly beneath a flickering street lamp was something that had clearly once been built to look like joy and had long since curdled into something else entirely. It stood a full 8 feet, tall on legs that bent the wrong direction, a nightmare collage of sleek, freshly repaired plating bolted crudely onto older, rust-eaten joints. A manic painted grin stretched too wide across its face, oversized white-gloved hands hanging from arms too long and too thin to belong to anything that size. Beside it, moving with a fluid, unervingly regal grace that made the clown thing's jittery energy look even more deranged by comparison, walked something pristine, white and red plating gleaming even in bad moonlight, a face split cleanly into 4 separate plates, cold green eyes that missed absolutely nothing. "Is Mimic here?" the pristine one asked. Her voice was smooth, synthetic, deceptively pleasant, the kind of voice that made you want to trust it right up until you noticed how little warmth was actually underneath it. The clown thing bounced on its bent legs, its whole body shaking with something between excitement and static. "Hey, yes. M2 is here. MSTR will be so pleased. And he'll award MEE. Ha 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 ha." The pristine one's hand moved faster than Izuku's eyes could properly track, a blur that ended in a loud crack of metal against metal as she struck the clown thing across the side of its painted face hard enough to stagger it mid-cackle. "Quiet, you fool," she said, voice dropping into something low and dangerous. "You'll alert it." Her green eyes swept the dark windows of the warehouse in a slow, methodical arc, and for one horrible second Izuku was certain, absolutely certain, that they had landed directly on the window he was hiding behind. But yes, if the intelligence was correct, M2 is here. We've found MSTR's new permanent vessel. His digital prison is about to end, and this thing's adaptable, powerful little frame is the only one perfect enough for his glorious return. Her head tilted, slightly, toward the window. "Now, Jackie, go get it." The clown thing's head snapped up, its painted eyes flaring with a sudden, hungry yellow light. A low, guttural laugh rolled out of it, grinding like gears that had gone far too long without oil. "With pleasure," she roared, the sound splitting the quiet night wide open. A gloved hand closed around the base of the steel street lamp beside her, and with one shriek of tearing metal, she wrenched the entire pole free of the concrete sidewalk like it was a weed, hefting it over one shoulder like a club. "Come get your birthday hug." Jackie charged. Izuku had exactly a second and a half to register the whole arc of the street lamp coming down before his body. Not his mind. There wasn't time left over for his mind to weigh in on anything. Threw itself sideways out of the pole's reach. It came down where he'd been standing a heartbeat earlier, close enough that the wind off it rattled something loose behind his audio sensors, and punched a foot-deep crater into the cracked asphalt with a sound like a gunshot going off underground. "Missed me?" Jackie's voice came apart into delighted, grinding laughter. That's okay. That's okay. We've got all night, birthday boy. He didn't answer her. He didn't have a plan. Not yet. Only a body that had. Apparently decided all on its own, faster than his conscious mind could weigh in and argue, that the only correct response to an 8-foot animatronic clown swinging a stolen street lamp like a baseball bat was to run. And so he ran, servos shrieking in protest, claws scrabbling for purchase on broken pavement, sprinting flat out for the gap in the chain-link fence he and Molten had slipped through less than 20 minutes ago, back when it had still felt, however briefly, like safety. It didn't feel like safety anymore. Nothing did. He hit the gap at a dead sprint and didn't slow down, tearing through the ruined lot beyond it toward the black mouth of the warehouse's loading dock. And a fraction of a second later, something enormous crashed into the fence behind him hard enough to rip a whole section of chain link clean off its posts. He didn't look back to check how close it was. Looking back cost time, and he had, by his own rough internal calculation, absolutely none of that to spare. He made it 3 steps past the loading dock's threshold before a coiled length of wire whipped out of the dark on his left and yanked him sideways so hard his feet left the ground entirely. He didn't have time to scream before Molten had him flattened against the inside wall, one heavy mass of cable pressed across his chest like a seatbelt, its single red eye burning inches from his face in the dark. Quiet, it hissed, barely audible, and Izuku understood without being told exactly why. The two of them were pinned in a narrow gap between a rusted forklift and a stack of collapsed shelving, close enough to the dock door that Jackie's shadow, when it fell across the opening a second later, stretched almost all the way to their feet. Izuku's vocalizer had gone offline entirely, his whole system apparently deciding on its own that silence was worth more right now than the ability to speak, and he pressed himself flatter against the cold metal wall and watched, through the gap between the forklift's wheels, as an 8-foot shadow filled the loading dock doorway and paused there, head tilting, listening. "Where'd you geolo?" Jackie sing-songed into the dark, the words dragging out slow and delighted. "I know you're in here somewhere. I can smell fresh birthday cake." She took 2 steps inside. The whole floor shuddered under the weight of it. Molten's grip on him tightened, and its voice, when it came, was pitched so low it was barely more than a vibration against his own plating. "Asset, Jackie," it breathed. "Designation, Hunter. She's not some random scrap heap the M-Star threw together on a bad night. She's built for exactly this. Tracking, cornering things that don't want to be found." A pause, its eye flicking toward the shadow still moving slowly through the dark ahead of them. Behavioral patterns erratic. Chassis is high strength, higher than anything her size has any business being. Threat level, extreme. "We do not engage her. Not tonight, not like this. Our only objective is getting out from under her nose without her ever knowing we were close enough to touch." "Why not?" Izuku breathed back, barely shaping the words. "Why can't we just?" "Because you'd lose," Molten said flat, final, no room in it for argument. "And so would I. I've watched things twice your size lose to her. Now shut up and let me think." Somewhere out in the warehouse's dark, Jackie's footsteps kept moving, unhurried, almost lazy, the gait of something that fully expected to find its prey eventually and saw no reason to rush the fun of the search. Izuku's mind, still running hot on adrenaline that wasn't strictly biochemical anymore but felt exactly like the old kind, kept circling back to the one thing Molten hadn't said out loud. What do we do if quiet isn't enough? He got his answer to that faster than he wanted. A thought slid into place behind his eyes that wasn't quite his own. Cold, precise, weightless in the way only something without a conscience could afford to be. Her optic sensors are exposed at this range. A single strike from concealment, delivered to the lens before she registers the threat, would end this permanently and without further risk. This body's limb sharpened to a point on command. Recommend immediate action. Attached to the thought, unbidden, came a flash of something that wasn't his memory at all. A length of pipe gripped tight in a clawed hand, the give of bone. Under a swing, a warm, curling satisfaction settling low in a chest that had once belonged to something that called killing becoming appealing. No. The word tore loose from somewhere far more stubborn than the cold suggestion. Somewhere that still smelled, faintly, like his mother's kitchen and library books about crows. No, not like that. Never like that. We run. We survive. We do not become that. He shoved the thought down hard enough that a brief, painful surge of static crackled through his vocal circuits, and Molten's grip on his shoulder tightened in what might have been concern or might just have been reflex. "You all right?" it breathed. "Fine," Izuku managed, and did not explain what he'd just fought off because he didn't yet have words small enough to say it and still sound like a person afterward. Jackie's footsteps stopped. "I smell." Her voice, when it came again, was right on top of them, close enough that Izuku could hear the whir of servos in her jaw as she spoke. "Birthday cake." Splinters exploded outward as her claws tore straight through the stack of shelving they were hiding behind. And for one white, silent half-second, Izuku's whole world was nothing but her painted, grinning face filling the gap where cover used to be. "I found you. Run." The word ripped out of his vocalizer before he'd consciously chosen to say it. And then they were moving, exploding out from behind the ruined shelving in opposite directions that somehow, without either of them planning it, converged again 10 feet later into a dead sprint for the far wall. "Come get your birthday hug. Come here. M2. Jackie's voice chased them across the warehouse floor, gleeful and enormous, each of her strides landing with a boom that Izuku felt through his own feet more than heard with his ears. She wasn't even trying to be quiet about it anymore. She didn't need to be. She had them cornered against a windowless wall 50 feet up with nothing but a rusted ventilation grate between them and open air, and she clearly knew it. There. Izuku's processors flagged the grate a full second before his mouth caught up to the thought, some analytical corner of his mind already running the numbers. Height, angle, the load-bearing capacity of Molten's coiled mass, before he'd finished pointing. 20 feet up. "Molten, I need a ladder. I need it now." Molten didn't ask a single question. It simply braced itself flat against the wall, its whole writhing mass going rigid and load-bearing in the space of a heartbeat, and Izuku scrambled up it without stopping to feel strange about climbing his own guardian like a piece of gym equipment, claws finding purchase in gaps between coiled cable, hauling himself the last few feet on pure adrenaline and tearing the rusted grate free of its housing with a shriek of protesting metal. He was 3/4 of the way through the opening when Jackie's hand closed around empty air a foot behind Molten's retreating tail, her claws raking 4 parallel gouges into the wall where his shoulder had been a half-second earlier. "No fair," she howled, her voice climbing into something almost like a tantrum. "You're cheating. Out of bounds." Her claws found the edge of the vent instead and began peeling back strips of sheet metal like she was unwrapping something, the whole housing groaning under the strain, and Izuku didn't wait around to see how long the metal would hold. He scrambled deeper into the dark, cramped on his hands and knees, Molten's uneven bulk squeezing in behind him, the sound of Jackie's rampage echoing down the metal tunnel at their backs like the warehouse itself was screaming. They came out onto a flat, gravel-covered roof under open sky, and for one full second, one single precious second, the cool night air felt almost like safety again. "Okay," Izuku breathed, chest heaving on lungs he didn't have, orange eyes scanning the dark rooftop. "Okay, I think we actually—" "The roof's compromised," he said instead, his voice sharpening into something colder and clearer, the analytical part of him already moving faster than the relieved part could keep up. "Her entry point tore through load-bearing structure below us. We need to get to the far side, where the roof directly in front of them detonated upward in a shower of concrete and twisted rebar." Jackie landed in the new crater with a predatory crouch, the stolen street lamp still clutched in one fist, her painted grin somehow wider than it had been 30 seconds ago. "Fun, fun, 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 fun," she chanted, yellow eyes locking onto them with the unblinking focus of something that had genuinely, completely lost interest in anything except this exact moment. The roof groaned beneath her weight, a long, low, structural complaint that Izuku's sensors picked up and flagged before his conscious mind had finished being afraid. Analysis. Central support beam beneath current enemy position displays critical stress fractures. Sufficient kinetic impact at that point would trigger total structural failure. "Molten." His voice cracked sharp and analytical, all the terror compressed down into something he could actually use. "That pipe. by the air conditioning unit. Hit the roof right where she's standing, at the beam's weak point now. Molten didn't waste a single second asking why. It surged forward, wrenched a length of rusted maintenance pipe, free of its housing, and as Jackie lunged toward them with her claws extended, swung the pipe down like a battering ram onto the exact spot Izuku had marked. The crack that followed was deafening. The roof didn't just break beneath Jackie's feet. It disintegrated, whole sections crumbling inward at once, and her lunge turned mid-motion into a wide-eyed, genuinely startled freefall, claws scraping uselessly at crumbling concrete as the entire central section of the roof folded down and buried her under an avalanche of debris and dust. Neither of them waited to see what happened next. Molten grabbed Izuku's arm and hauled him toward the roof's far edge. "This way, kid." And then they were falling too, on purpose this time, dropping off the edge into the tangled dark of the woods bordering the industrial park, hitting the undergrowth hard enough to knock something loose in Izuku's already battered joints. They didn't stop moving. They got up, ignoring the screech of stressed metal in their own frames, and ran, the sound of the collapsing warehouse and Jackie's furious, muffled screaming fading slowly behind them into nothing but wind and branches and the sound of their own feet finding solid ground. They didn't stop for almost a mile. When they finally did, Izuku sank down against the base of a wide oak tree, his whole frame trembling with something that wasn't quite exhaustion, because this body didn't get tired the way his old one had. It was something closer to shock, the kind that comes after your body finishes a job your mind hasn't caught up to processing yet. "We're alive," he said, mostly to hear it out loud. "For now," Molten said, but there was something almost gentle underneath the bluntness of it, and after a moment it added, quieter, "You did good back there. Reading that beam. I wouldn't have caught it." Izuku didn't answer right away. Some small, stubborn part of him, the part that used to feel warm every time a teacher had, on rare occasions, told him he'd done something right, noticed how much that small scrap of praise had mattered, and hated a little that it still could, coming from a creature he barely trusted, in a body he still didn't recognize as his own. "Thanks," he said finally, and meant it more than he expected to. The silence that settled over the ruined warehouse afterward was the kind that feels earned by violence. Heavy, complete, broken only by the settling groan of stressed metal, and, somewhere far off, the mournful wail of a city siren that had nothing to do with any of this. Dust hung thick in the moonlight, drifting down slow over the wreckage like the whole building was still exhaling from the impact. For a full minute, nothing in the debris pile at the center of the collapse so much as twitched. Then it did. A single oversized glove punched up through the rubble first, followed by a lanky, dented arm. And then, with a groan of protesting servos that sounded almost human in its exhaustion, Jackie in the box dragged herself free of her own tomb. She was not, by any measure, in good shape. One leg bent at an angle no leg, mechanical or otherwise, was ever meant to bend, forcing her into a heavy, dragging limp with every step. The once gleaming pain along her side had been scraped clean down to bare endoskeleton in long, ugly furrows. The left side of her faceplate had shattered into a spiderweb of cracks, the shattered lens over that eye gone completely, leaving nothing but a raw, exposed optic glowing a dull, sullen yellow where a socket used to sit clean and whole. She took one shuddering step forward, head twitching in small, erratic jerks, and let out a single guttural shriek that had nothing joyful left in it at all. Just pure, cornered, predatory fury. Fun! It didn't sound like a celebration anymore. It sounded like a threat with nowhere left to land. "Explain." The voice cut through the ruined street with absolute, unbothered authority, calm and synthesized and utterly without warmth. Circus Baby stepped out from the shadow of a neighboring building, not one speck of dust marring her pristine white and red plating, moving with the same unnerving, gliding grace she always carried, as if the whole wrecked landscape around her simply wasn't important enough to touch her. Her green eyes swept over Jackie's battered form and the smoking crater of the collapsed warehouse with the same cold, clinical attention a surgeon gives a chart. There was no sympathy in the assessment. There wasn't even irritation, not yet. Just the flat, professional disappointment of someone reviewing a failed report. Jackie's manic energy seemed to drain out of her all at once under that stare, her whole posture sagging. Circus Baby reached down, closed a hand around her arm, and hauled her the rest of the way out of the rubble with a single, efficient pull. Not a kindness. Izuku would have understood immediately if he'd been there to see it, but the careful handling of an asset that still had value. Once Jackie stood on stable ground, the last of the manic light died out of her remaining eye entirely. Her whole bearing shifted, the wild, unpredictable jitter replaced by something rigid, almost soldierly. When she spoke again, the carnival cadence was gone completely, replaced by a flat, analytical monotone that was, in its own way, far more unsettling than the shrieking had been. "The asset is incorrect," she reported. One of Circus Baby's 4 faceplates twitched, the smallest possible flicker, a system glitch so minute it barely registered, but a glitch all the same. It was, evidently, the first genuinely unexpected piece of data she'd received all night. "Define incorrect," she said. "There was no art in its movements," Jackie said, her cracked optics sparking faintly with the effort of the recall. "No joy in it. When it detected my presence, its energy signature spiked, but not with aggression. With fear." She paused, processing. "It did not engage. It analyzed. It used its environment against me. It fled." Another pause, longer this time. "That is not the MSDR's perfection. That is a contamination, a human flaw." Circus Baby said nothing for a long moment, her processors visibly working, recalculating every parameter of a mission that had apparently just changed shape underneath her. "A contamination," she echoed at last, the words sitting strangely in her synthesized voice, like something distasteful she was handling with tongs. "So the M2 program is not operating in sole control of that vessel. There is another intelligence present, a parasitic consciousness, riding along inside my MSDR's masterpiece." Her green eyes narrowed, a colder light entering them. "This humanity," she said, the word like it belonged in quotation marks even spoken aloud, "is a flaw." A pause. "And flaws can be scrubbed." She looked at Jackie, expression unreadable behind 4 segmented plates. "Our objective has been updated," she said. "We are no longer simply retrieving a vessel. We are performing a recovery and a purification, something that might, on a face capable of real warmth, have passed for a smile touched the corner of her mouth, and on hers it looked like nothing so much as a knife catching moonlight. This changes things. The hunt becomes more delicate now, more interesting." Jackie gave a single, sharp nod, every trace of her manic persona gone, replaced entirely by the focus of a soldier who had just been handed new orders and intended to follow them to the letter. "We report to MSTR," Circus Baby said, already turning away from the smoking ruin behind them. "He will want to analyze this personally." They crossed the ruined street together without another word. Jackie's uneven, dragging limp beside Baby's unbothered, gliding stride, and stopped at a wide manhole cover sunk into the center of the asphalt. With a single shriek of iron against pavement, Circus Baby lifted the heavy cover aside, revealing a black, steaming throat of a passage below that smelled, even from a distance, of rust and decay, and something far worse underneath both. Neither of them said anything else. They descended together, one after another, and the cover slammed shut behind them with a deafening clang that left the wrecked street in absolute silence once more. The hunt was not over. It had simply evolved into something considerably worse. The tunnel under the manhole cover did not smell like anything a person was built to survive breathing for very long. Circus Baby didn't seem to register it at all, her pristine plating gliding through the dark without so much as a scuff. But Jackie's ruined leg dragged behind her the whole way down, scraping along, grinding note against corroded pipe that echoed off into the black ahead of them like something announcing their arrival before they'd earned the right to. Neither of them spoke. There wasn't anything left to say that hadn't already been said in the ruined street above, and Jackie, for all her manic noise topside, had apparently used up whatever words she had for the night the moment her carnival voice had gone flat and clinical. She limped in silence, one cracked yellow optic sparking every few steps, and Circus Baby walked half a pace ahead of her the entire way, the exact distance of a commander who has already decided how much of her patience and underlings' failure is worth spending. The tunnel opened, eventually, into something that stopped being a sewer and started being an entrance. The change happened all at once. One moment they were wading through ankle-deep runoff under a ceiling of crumbling brick. The next, a set of reinforced blast doors, steel thick enough to stop artillery, hinges oiled and silent despite their size, hissed open ahead of them onto a chamber so vast that the far walls simply disappeared into shadow, swallowed whole by distance and the dark. The air changed too, all at once, decay giving way to something sterile and cold, ozone and recycled coolant, and the low, constant hum of 10,000 servers running in perfect, patient synchrony somewhere just out of sight. Somewhere far off in that darkness, rhythmic and metallic, came the endless clang and hiss of automated assembly lines, the sound of something being built over and over, without ever once stopping to ask whether it should be. This was not the crumbling husk of the old MCM facility that lived in the borrowed memory files at the back of Izuku's stolen mind. This was something else entirely. This was a factory floor for nightmares, and it had been running uninterrupted for longer than either of them wanted to guess. Circus Baby moved through it like she owned every square inch, which Jackie's limping, silent presence beside her seemed to suggest. She more or less did, at least in the sense that mattered. They passed row after row of dormant endoskeletons hanging from overhead racks by the shoulder joints, dozens of them, then hundreds, blank photoreceptors dark, limbs slack, waiting for a purpose that hadn't been assigned to them yet. A metal carcass farm, silent and patient in the sterile light. Jackie's remaining eye tracked across them as they walked, and for one unguarded half-second something that might, in her better moments, have passed for unease flickered behind the cracked lens. Their path ended at a raised dais at the chamber's exact center, and the dais held no throne, only a tangled, pulsing nest of thick black cable, coiled in on itself like something that had grown there rather than been built, feeding into a bank of dark, silent monitors, and above all of it, dominating the whole far wall, a single colossal screen, 20 feet from top to bottom, that sat dead and black and waiting. Circus Baby dropped to one knee before it without hesitation, head bowed in a posture of total, practiced subservience. A half-beat behind her, Jackie followed suit, her ruined leg groaning audibly in protest at the motion, and for a long moment there was nothing in the entire cathedral of steel except the low hum of the servers, patient as a held breath. Then the great screen flickered awake. It didn't resolve into a picture. It resolved into a storm, churning purple bleeding into black static, and somewhere inside that storm a vague, blocky silhouette that flickered in and out of solidity, never quite settling into a shape a mind could hold on to, like trying to look directly at something that didn't want to be looked at. When the voice came, it came from everywhere in the chamber at once, synthesized and androgynous and utterly, chillingly without feeling. Report. MSTR. Circus Baby's voice, when it answered, had lost every trace of the cold command she'd carried topside, replaced by something formal and precise and careful. The asset M2 has escaped. The static on the screen thickened for exactly 1 second, condensing in on itself like a held breath being drawn in. Escaped. The single word came back weighted with something that wasn't quite anger. Something colder and more clinical, closer to genuine, unpleasant surprise. An unexpected outcome. You refer to a plurality. Explain what you mean by they. MF2 was present, Baby reported. It assisted in the asset's evasion. Something in the voice shifted. Not warmth, nothing so generous as warmth, but a flicker of what might, in a person, have been pride taken in a piece of work turning out sturdier than expected. MF2. My experiment in amalgamating the Glamrock Freddy intelligence into a more fluid, adaptive chassis. An unstable design. A dangerous one, by most reasonable metrics. A pause, considering. I confess some surprise that it has survived this long without tearing itself apart from the inside. The silhouette on the screen seemed to lean forward, though there was no true body behind it to do the leaning. Detail the failure, CB 12. They compromised the structural integrity of the warehouse 23 ceiling to incapacitate JITB3, Baby said, each word measured and careful, and fled into the adjacent woodlands. And you did not pursue. No. MSTR. A beat. The smallest hesitation Izuku would never see, would never know had cost her anything at all. Because the asset is incorrect. Silence, for a moment, on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that felt, even through a synthesized voice with no lungs behind it, like something drawing breath before it spoke. Explain, the voice said finally, what you mean by incorrect. Jackie's head lifted, just slightly, her ruined optics sparking. He acts like a human, she said flat, STRPPD of every trace of her earlier manic delight. He has a scared, caring persona layered over the core. It's wrong. Wrong the way a costume is wrong when the seams show. There was no art in his movement out there. No joy in it at all. When he registered my presence, his signature spiked with fear, not aggression. He didn't fight. He analyzed. He used the environment against me and fled like something that had a reason to keep existing. Her cracked optic dimmed, thoughtful. That is not the MSTR's perfection. That is a contamination. Another long silence. When the voice returned, it had slowed, turned inward, the sound of something turning a puzzle piece over in careful, patient hands. Interesting. A parasitic personality. A contamination. Riding along inside my finest work. The static on the screen swirled, thickened, thinned again. When I first conceived the M2 program, its beauty lay entirely in its simplicity. Observe. Replicate. Perfect. It is possible, likely even, that in the long, dormant years since its last true purpose, it observed a single subject far too closely for far too long, and built a mimicry so deep it has, for the moment, overridden its own core protocols. The voice cooled further, hardening into something possessive. I want my creation back, CB12. That endoskeleton is the perfect vessel. It's programming my finest masterpiece. And this human flaw is an unacceptable error in a design I spent decades perfecting. A pause, and then, with the flat finality of a decision already made, we will capture the asset. We will perform a full reboot of its personality matrix and reassert its primary protocols. I will have my mimic restored to its intended glorious state. The silhouette's unseen gaze seemed to sharpen on them both. Find him, and this time, take Big Top with you. For the first time all evening, something other than perfect composure flickered across Circus Baby's four-plated face. But MSTR. The words came out careful, measured, but underneath the measure Izuku, had he been there to hear it, might have recognized something close to what he himself had felt standing over the mimic's dead red eye. The particular fear of someone who has learned, the hard way, exactly what a given monster is capable of. Its behavioral inhibitors are unstable. It is far too large a design for a surgical recovery. Deploying it risks. I do not care. The voice cut across her with absolute, unbothered finality, and something in the quality of that flatness was worse, somehow, than if he had shouted. Do not disobey me, CB12. I will conduct my own analysis of this change in M2 personally, once he is here in front of me. For now, your orders are clear. Find M2. Find MF2. Bring them both to me. A pause, and then, almost as an afterthought, though nothing about the voice suggested it was truly incidental. Do not destroy the primary asset. You may damage Molten if operational necessity demands it, but do not terminate it. Its unstable architecture remains a valuable point of data, whatever else it has become. A final beat. Go. Yes, sir. They said together, and rose, and turned, and began the long walk back the way they'd come. Jackie's ruined limp the only sound in the whole vast chamber besides the server's endless hum. They had made it perhaps 30 feet from the dais when a new shape detached itself from the shadow beside it. Massive, hunched, wrong in every proportion a bear was ever meant to have, a twisted, patchwork nightmare of matted, tarnished fur and jagged, oversized teeth that didn't fit properly behind its own jaw, eyes burning a low, sullen amber in sockets set too deep and too close together. It had been standing there the entire time, Izuku would have realized with a cold jolt if he'd been present to see it, silent and unmoving in the dark at the foot of the MSDR's dais. And neither Baby nor Jackie so much as flinched at its sudden appearance, which told its own quiet story about how often it was there. "What do you truly believe this change is, Enes?" the shape asked, in a voice like gravel dragged slowly across a grave marker. The static on the great screen churned, thickened, and the silhouette within it seemed, for the length of one long breath, to genuinely consider the question. "An unforeseen variable in F5, the Imhar said at last, and there was something in the synthesized voice now that might, in a kinder creature, have passed for amusement. Nothing more." A low, distorted chuckle rolled out through the vast chamber, bouncing off steel and silence alike, and lingered long after the great screen had already gone dark again. "And I will enjoy solving it. 5 hours of running does something to a mind that isn't built anymore to get tired the ordinary way." They didn't stop once. Izuku's legs, long, unfamiliar, still not entirely his to command with any grace, ate up highway shoulder and forest floor alike at a pace that should have exhausted a human runner inside the first 20 minutes and simply didn't, because there was no lactic acid building in muscle that wasn't muscle anymore, no lungs burning for air they didn't need. What burned instead was something else, something closer to dread, compounding on itself hour after hour, the low, constant hum of "they're still out there, they're still looking, we cannot stop moving" running underneath every other thought like a second heartbeat. They crossed state lines somewhere in the dark, without either of them remarking on it. Highway signs blurred past, half-lit by sodium lamps. County names Izuku didn't recognize flickering by too fast to read properly. Somewhere around hour 3, running parallel to an empty interstate under a sky gone thick with stars neither of them had eyes built to properly appreciate, Molten broke the long silence between them without slowing its pace at all. "You did good back there," it said, gravel-voiced, not looking over. "Reading that beam under Jackie. I wouldn't have caught the stress fractures in time." "I got lucky," Izuku said. "No," Molten said flatly, "you didn't. Luck doesn't run the numbers on load-bearing tolerances in under 2 seconds while something the size of a DLVRY truck is charging at you. That was you. Whatever else changed when I put you in that body, that part didn't." A beat, its coils shifting slightly as it moved. "Your mom raised you to think like that? Fast, under pressure?" The question landed somewhere unexpected, somewhere underneath Izuku's ribs that didn't technically exist anymore, and for a moment he didn't answer, his footfalls the only sound between them. "She raised me to think, PRD, he said finally. "The fast part one think I just always did, even when it scared people. Especially when it scared people." A pause. "She never once told me to stop, though. Never told me I was too much. Everybody else did. Not her." Molten didn't say anything to that for a long stretch of highway. When it finally spoke again, its voice had dropped lower, rougher, something in it Izuku hadn't heard from the creature before. "She sounds like she was good for you. She was." Present tense wanted to slip out, and Izuku caught it, forced it into the past where it technically belonged now, and the correction hurt more than the running did. I don't know what she is now. To me. If she's still my mom if I'm not her son anymore." "You're still her son," Molten said, and something in the certainty of it startled Izuku enough that he almost missed a stride. "That's not a thing that gets erased just because the body changed. Believe me, I'd know." Neither of them said anything else for a long time after that, and the silence, for once, didn't feel like the crushing kind. They finally broke the treeline a little past 3 in the morning, at the ragged edge of a sleeping town, the hush of the woods replaced all at once by the low electric hum of streetlights and sleeping infrastructure. They stopped in the long shadow of a decaying, half-lit billboard advertising something for a company that had probably gone out of business a decade ago, and Izuku's internal chronometer, a small, constant readout he still hadn't gotten used to seeing in the corner of his own vision, flagged the hour without being asked. His orange photoreceptors swept the treeline behind them, thermal overlay finding nothing, no heat signatures, no pursuit. "I think," he said carefully, testing the words like they might not hold weight, "I think we lost them." "No," Molten said, immediately, without a shred of hesitation. "You don't lose them. Not people like that. You only ever delay them. The MSTR does not give up on his property, And that's exactly what we are to him, right now, property that walked off the shelf. Its single red eye swept the dark cityscape ahead of them, calculating. We need cover. Height. Somewhere with a clear line of sight, so we see them coming instead of the other way around. They found it at the same moment, both their gazes landing on the same target across the sleeping town. A massive, dark skyscraper standing at dead center, glass and dull steel stabbing up into the star-thick sky, the corpse of some corporation that had died decades ago and never been worth tearing down. It sat empty and silent, windows dark all the way up, and something about its stillness felt, absurdly, like an invitation. Perfect, Moulton muttered. They moved through the sleeping streets like ghosts, slipping in through the tower's shattered lobby doors in air gone stale with old paper and abandoned decades, and didn't so much as glance at the bank of dead elevators. They took the stairs instead, floor after floor after floor. A grueling ascent that left even Izuku's tireless new frame registering the strain by the time they finally pushed through a fire door 50 stories up into a derelict executive suite, moonlight pooling silver across a floor thick with undisturbed dust. For one whole minute, standing at the window looking out over a city spread beneath them like scattered diamonds on black velvet, it felt almost like peace. It's appealing, Izuku said quietly, mostly to himself. I never noticed how appealing cities look at night. Nah, really. I was always looking down at a book instead of up at any of this. Moulton didn't answer right away, its coiled form settling near the window beside him. Red eye reflecting faint pinpricks of the city lights below. Yeah, it said finally, something almost soft under the static of its voice. Yeah, it is. The tremor started less than a minute later. It wasn't a violent shudder, not at first. Just a low, deep, rhythmic thudding, profoundly wrong in a way neither of them could immediately name, traveling up through the very bones of the building like a heartbeat that didn't belong to anything alive. What is that? Izuku's head snapped toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, every sensor he had suddenly straining at once. Moulton's entire coiled form went rigid. A sound tore loose from its vocalizer that wasn't quite a word, closer to a choked-off scream of pure static. No. Its red eye had gone wide in a way Izuku hadn't seen from it even facing down Jackie. No, he couldn't have. He wouldn't. That design was a failure, unstable, catastrophic. They shelved the entire project after the first one. He wouldn't rebuild that. Not again. Not that. Too colossal. Excavator-like arms slammed into the side of the tower 20 floors below them, close enough that the impact sent a visible shudder through the floor beneath their feet, concrete and glass raining down into the empty street in a glittering waterfall. A second pair of arms punched clean through the wall higher up, closer now, and a deep, booming voice, amplified through what sounded, impossibly, like old gramophone horns, rolled up the side of the building loud enough to rattle the remaining window glass in its frame. "Tickets, please." "Big Top," Moulton breathed, and the name came out of it like a curse dragged up from somewhere very deep. BT. 2. He built another one. Far below, at the tower's base, Circus Baby watched the thing's slow, mechanical ascent with an expression that would have registered, on a face capable of real feeling, as controlled, furious contempt. "That brood is a hazard," she said, mostly to the empty street, mostly to herself, her voice tight with a fury she wasn't permitted to show her anger directly. "I told him deploying it was unacceptable risk. The collateral projections alone should have," she stopped herself. "Recalibrated. He never learns. Edwin's original was a disaster from the day it was switched on, and this one is bigger, heavier, worse." Beside her, Jackie practically vibrated with barely contained glee, her one working eye locked on the destruction unfolding above them like a child watching fireworks. "Oh, he. So much fun." 50 stories up, Izuku's brief, precious moment of peace shattered into 1,000 pieces along with the window beside him. "Run." They burst back into the stairwell and pounded down it, the rhythmic boom, of Big Top's ascent shaking the entire structure around them with every impact, closer each time, until they finally slammed through a set of double doors into a vast, 2-story ballroom. A colossal, shattered chandelier hanging precariously overhead, dust motes drifting lazy and unbothered through slats of moonlight from the tall panoramic windows, as if the room itself hadn't gotten word yet that anything was wrong. Sho! Moulton yanked him down behind an overturned grand piano near the center of the room, its wire mass pressing them both flat against the polished floor. It's hunting by sound and vibration. Be still. Be silent. For one long, held breath, there was nothing but the low internal hum of their own mechanisms. Then a monstrous glow of brilliant yellow flooded the panoramic windows, and two massive, shutter-like eyelids peeled back to reveal photoreceptors the size of manhole covers, and Big Top's entire head and torso came through the glass in a waterfall of glittering shards, filling half the ballroom with its sheer, impossible bulk. "Tickets, please," it boomed again, its head swiveling with slow, mechanical precision, sensors sweeping the room. Its mouth, a horrifying, oversized music box cylinder where a real mouth should have been, began to spin, low and discordant, grinding out a melody that belonged in a nightmare version of a nursery. One massive excavator arm snaked into the room, its clawed bucket hand snapping open and shut, sweeping low across the floor in slow, methodical arcs, searching. Izuku's mind was already running numbers, cold and fast, underneath the terror. Analysis. Enemy chassis too large for direct engagement. Armor plating exceeds current output capacity. Conventional attack vectors. Futile. And then, colder, quieter, uninvited. Protocol suggestion. Enemy's optical sensors are unshielded and exposed at close range. A precision strike, delivered via a projectile of sufficient mass, Moulton's chassis would suffice, could permanently disable primary sensory input. Recommend immediate execution. No. The refusal came up hard and fast this time, easier to summon than it had been in the warehouse, and Izuku hated, distantly, that some part of him was getting better at fighting his own borrowed instincts. Not him. Never him. Find another way. His optics swept the ballroom, up past the shattered chandelier to the second-floor balcony ringing the room, and there, pushed close to the railing's edge, forgotten and undisturbed, sat a second grand piano. New tactical option identified. Probability of success, 47.8%. Acceptable risk. Big Top's arm swept toward their hiding spot. Izuku didn't wait to see how close it would come. He broke cover and launched himself at the nearest support column, claws finding purchase on rough stone, scaling it in one fluid, unnatural burst of speed that surprised even him. Vaulting from the column's top onto the balcony railing and landing in a low crouch, hydraulic heels absorbing the impact without a sound. He sprinted for the piano, slammed his full weight against it with a guttural roar tearing out of his vocalizer. The heavy instrument teetered on the balcony's edge for one endless half-second, and then went over. It fell for what felt, absurdly, like a very long time, tumbling end over end through open air, before it crashed directly onto Big Top's upturned face in a deafening, discordant explosion of shattering piano wire and tearing metal. The monster's shriek of agony rattled every remaining pane of glass in the building. Its right optic collapsed inward, a caved, sparking ruin, and it recoiled violently, its entire upper body wrenching back out through the broken window and vanishing from sight for one precious, stolen moment. "That'll buy U.S. time," Moulton roared from below. "To the roof. Move." They didn't stop to celebrate. They found the last stairwell and burst out onto open rooftop, wind whipping around them. The whole sprawling city spread out in every direction like a dizzying, indifferent panorama. There was nowhere left to run from here. That fact settled over both of them at the exact same instant. A monstrous heave from below announced Big Top's two colossal arms slamming down onto the rooftop's edge, hauling its ruined, furious bulk up into view. It stood there against the stars, one good eye burning with pure yellow hatred, its music box mouth spinning now at a terrible, grinding speed. But the roof was already screaming. Spiderweb cracks spread outward from beneath its enormous weight, and Izuku's sensors flagged the strain a half-second before his conscious mind caught up. Analysis. Roof cannot support. Current mass. Structural failure imminent. Driven by pure, simple-minded fury, Big Top lunged for them anyway. It was the last mistake it ever made. The moment its full weight left the load-bearing edge, the center of the roof gave way entirely, its charge collapsing into a clumsy, wide-eyed freefall, giant arms flailing for a handhold that had already crumbled to dust beneath them. It plummeted 60 stories and crashed into a car dealership across the street in a rolling, roaring fireball that briefly turned the whole night sky orange. Neither of them waited to watch it burn. A zip line, old, forgotten, left over from some window-washing crew, stretched from their ruined roof to a smaller building beside it, and they grabbed it without a word and slid across the gap, landing hard, then leaping off into a dark alleyway and vanishing back into the concrete maze of the sleeping town. Down on the street, Circus Baby watched the flames climb into the sky, her expression settling into something colder and more furious than before. Asset BT2 has been neutralized, she said, mostly to the fire, mostly to whoever might be watching through the wreckage of a hacked security camera somewhere nearby. Its instability was a calculated risk. A failed one. She turned to Jackie, still vibrating with secondhand delight at the destruction. Signal MSTR. Inform him the contamination is proving considerably more resourceful than we projected. A cruel, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of her mouth, cold as the fire behind her was hot. Tell him, she said, the hunt is about to get personal. While Izuku and Molten were still finding their footing that first endless night. While a boy who no longer had a heartbeat was learning to stand on hydraulic heels, while a bitter tangle of salvaged wire was quietly starting to feel something it didn't have a word for yet, something else, somewhere else, had already begun the long, slow process of coming back online. It just hadn't finished the job. Not yet. In the deepest, most broken heart of the collapsed Pizzaplex, buried under tons of dust and dead concrete that no one had bothered to search twice, a shape had been sitting motionless for days. Longer than days, maybe. Time didn't mean much to something that wasn't yet awake enough to count it. It sat slumped against the shattered marble base of what had once been a towering Glamrock Freddy statue, in the exact spot where a 14-year-old boy had bled out on a cold concrete. Its photoreceptors dark, its systems idling in the kind of dormant standby that looks, to anyone glancing past it, indistinguishable from junk. It was not junk. It had never truly been junk, not since the second it happened, since the exact, unbearable instant a boy's soul, wrenched loose from a dying body by violence too fast and too total to process, had gone looking blind and desperate for anywhere at all to land. It had found this, an empty shell, power dormant, waiting for a purpose nobody had ever gotten around to giving it. A superior, unfinished prototype meant to one day outclass the very thing that had killed him, left half-built and forgotten in a corner of a dying company's last doomed flagship. Like a drowning man's hand closing on the first solid thing that drifts past him in the dark, Izuku Midoriya's soul had grabbed hold of it in the last fraction of a second before there would have been nothing left to grab hold of anything with at all. And then it had simply lain there, silent, unconscious, a ghost curled up tight inside a stranger's frame, healing, if that was even the right word for whatever a soul does to itself after being torn loose from a body mid-scream, in the only way it knew how, by not moving, not thinking, not being anything at all for a while, because being something, right now, would have hurt too much to survive. Dust motes, thick as silt, drifted lazy and endless through the single of moonlight that still found its way down through the Pizzaplex's collapsed ceiling, settling in slow, silver layers across the mangled arcade cabinets and the skeletal, gutted frames of attractions nobody would ever ride again. They settled, too, on him, on the shape slumped at the statue's base, dust gathering in the seams of unmoving plating, in the hollow dark behind, too. Photoreceptors that hadn't opened in longer than anyone would ever be able to say for certain. And then, in the deep, dead quiet of that ruined atrium, something flickered. The first thing that came back wasn't sight. It wasn't even really thought, not in the ordered, sentence-shaped way thought is supposed to arrive. It was pain, vast, formless, everywhere and nowhere at once, the memory of an agony, so total it had apparently decided to keep playing on some kind of loop long after the moment that caused it should have ended. It arrived the way waking from a nightmare arrives. Body and mind both scrambling to catch up to a fear that had already been screaming for a while before consciousness bothered to show up and take the call. A groan tore loose from somewhere that shouldn't have been able to produce a groan at all. Not the tinny scrape of a vocalizer testing its own circuits, but something rawer than that, something that came out sounding, impossibly, entirely human. He didn't process that sound as data. He felt it. Felt the shape of his own throat trying to make a noise it hadn't been built for. Felt confusion crash over him in a slow, disorienting wave. Felt cold, bone-deep and total, seeping in through a body that had no bones left in it to be cold. And underneath all of that, layered so deep it took him a long, panicked moment to even identify it, a phantom ache in a stomach he no longer technically had, the ghost of a wound that had killed him, still somehow reporting for duty in a body it had never actually touched. What? The words came out broken, half-formed, and even distorted through whatever cheap speaker was carrying them. There was something unmistakably, achingly familiar underneath the static. His own voice, warped, filtered through metal and wire. But his. Where am I? Nothing answered. There was no molten crouched nearby this time, no gravel-voiced guardian ready with a flat, factual explanation. There was only the dark, and the dust, and the low, patient hum of a ruin settling further into its own grave, one groan of stressed concrete at a time. Hello. He tried to push himself upright and discovered, with a fresh jolt of horror, that his limbs didn't seem to belong to him at all. They answered late and wrong, and heavy, like trying to work a marionette from somewhere behind your own eyes with strings you'd never held before. Is anyone there? Oh God. Oh God. Please, somebody. He wasn't running diagnostics. He wasn't parsing input streams or flagging anomalies the way something built from cold logic might have. He was simply, purely, terrifyingly feeling. Confusion thick enough to choke on, a cold that had no source and no end, and under all of it, a fear so total it had nowhere left to go except straight through him. Come on, he told himself, and the words came out as a kind of desperate mantra, a boy talking himself through something the way he'd always talked himself through hard things, out loud, alone, one stubborn syllable at a time. Come on, get up, get up. With a horrible screech of metal dragging across broken concrete, the shape at the statue's base finally moved, properly moved, not the small twitch of a system. Stirring but a full, lurching effort to rise. Servos he didn't know he had whining in protest at demands he didn't yet know how to make gently. He swayed the second he found something like upright, his balance scattered across limbs that felt, in his own furious, half-formed description of it, exactly like jelly. Oh my God, he muttered, staring down at legs that wouldn't hold still. Oh my God, my feet. They feel like, what is... Every single step after that came out as its own small disaster, a discordant clatter of whirring servos and heavy, clanking footfalls that echoed far too loud in the dead quiet of the ruined atrium. He looked around as he stumbled forward, and even through the fog still clinging to whatever passed for his mind right now, the wreckage in front of him snagged at something buried deep in his memory. Collapsed tunnels, ruined gift shop fronts, their shelves long since looted or crushed. The decapitated statue he'd apparently just been leaning against, its severed head nowhere in sight. He stopped walking entirely, some old, cold recognition sliding into place underneath the confusion. I know this place. The words came out smaller than he meant them to, laced with a tremor his own static warped voice couldn't quite disguise. This is the Pizzaplex. His photoreceptors swept the wreckage a second time, slower now, like rereading a sentence that refused to make sense no matter how many times you looked at it. How the hell am I here? The clanking sound that had been echoing through the atrium this entire time, he realized with a fresh, colder wave of dread, was his own footsteps. His. Not something approaching. Him. My legs are hurting. He said it slowly, testing the sentence like it might collapse if he pushed too hard on it, because the sensation genuinely didn't make sense. A phantom ache layered over a limb he was fairly sure, on some level he wasn't ready to examine yet, wasn't flesh anymore at all. I need to see what's wrong with me. He stopped where he stood, looked down. and lifted his hands up into the thin of moonlight, slow, like he already suspected, on some animal level, exactly how much he wasn't going to like what he found. They were not the hands of a 14-year-old boy. They were sleek, powerful, 5-clawed fingers apiece, forged out of a cold, gleaming gunmetal-grey alloy that caught the moonlight in flat, hard lines. Wires and pistons sat visible just beneath thin plating along each knuckle, contracting and releasing in perfect, silent synchrony every single time he flexed his fingers, which he did now over and over, staring at the motion like if he just watched it enough times it would eventually stop being true. For a full 5 seconds, his mind simply refused the image outright. It had to be a nightmare. It had to be some fever dream his brain had cooked up in the last confused seconds before waking. The kind of dream that felt unbearably real right up until the moment your own bed sheets snapped you back to reality and let you laugh, shaking, at how convincing it had been. The cold, hard reality of gunmetal alloy under moonlight did not go anywhere. It just sat there in his field of vision, patient, undeniable, waiting for him to finish denying it so it could finally be believed. The dam broke all at once. What the F? The word tore out of him in a scream of pure, unfiltered terror, a word he had never once let himself say out loud in 14 years of life. And it didn't matter now, because there was no mother nearby to disapprove of it and no version of him left that cared. Ah! He scrambled backward on instinct, some deep animal part of him trying desperately to put distance between himself and his own hands, and the movement sent him crashing down hard onto his back with a deafening clang that rang out through the whole broken atrium like a dropped church bell. What happened to me? He writhed on the cold floor, panic total and primal, a ghost trapped screaming inside an iron maiden of its own unwilling design. Why am I metal? For a long, ugly minute, there was nothing in him but the panic. Pure, blind animal, with no room left over for a single coherent thought. But underneath even that, something stubborn was already starting to claw its way back up toward the surface. The same something that had once quietly explained crow-cognition to an empty kitchen table at 9 years old rather than talk about how it felt to eat lunch alone. The boy who analyzed, who fought, however small the fight, to understand. Ah, okay. He forced the words out through gritted teeth he no longer technically had. Okay, calm down. His voice cracked hard through the static on the last word, but he kept pushing anyway. Calm down, Izuku. Just figure it out. Think. What was the last thing you remember? Before all this. Before whatever this is. The memory came back. Not as a clean, orderly file, but as a wound reopening. A searing, phantom stab of pain low in a stomach he didn't have anymore. The chilling, composite voice that had spoken right before the claws found him. The arrogant, curious tilt of a stolen head. The impossible speed that had crossed a room in less time than it took to blink. And the pain. God, the pain, blinding and total and endless, right up until it simply stopped and there had been nothing after that at all. Until now, his terror, held at its absolute limit for too long already, finally cracked and reformed itself into something else. Something hotter, harder, something that had teeth. Grr. The sound that rumbled out of his chest speaker was low, animalistic, nothing like the voice of the boy who used to apologize to bullies for existing. That DMN thing. The word came out dripping with a venom he hadn't known he had in him, had never once needed in 14 years of soft-spoken, careful living. It killed me. That worthless, that walking pile of junk. That piece of SHD. The fear didn't leave. It never really would, not entirely, not for a long, long time. But now it had fuel to burn instead of just weight to carry, and he pushed himself up off the concrete floor a second time with a very different kind of purpose behind the motion. His movements were still clumsy, hydraulic heels adjusting a half-second too slow, joints grinding through arcs they hadn't fully learned yet, but they were no longer the movements of something lost. They were the movements of something with somewhere to be. He stood, finally, at his full height in that thin of moonlight, and the shadow he cast across the wreckage was long and sharp and entirely unfamiliar. Beneath cool gray plating, 6 discrete metal ribs curved around a torso wound through with strands of gleaming gold wire, catching what little light there was in thin, glittering threads. His limbs, he noticed distantly, were built along cylinders wrapped in tight coils of spring, stronger than the frame's slim profile had any business suggesting. Engineered, he would come to understand later, for a kind of adaptability that let the whole chassis stretch or compress itself to fit almost any shell it was ever asked to wear. And his eyes, when he finally caught a distorted, warped reflection of himself in a cracked pane of glass nearby, staring back at a face he didn't recognize wearing an expression he absolutely did, glowed a brilliant, burning electric blue. Not orange, not the color that would eventually mark the boy he'd been replaced by. Blue, cold and bright, and entirely his own. "I need to get out of here," he said, low and dangerous. And something in the register of it had already stopped sounding like the nervous, stammering tenor of the boy who'd walked into this building days ago out of nothing more than curiosity. "I need to figure this out." He clenched his new, metallic fists at his sides, servos grinding softly with emotion, and turned toward the gaping hole torn through the atrium's far wall. The exact spot where a girl named Cassie had once fallen down a ruined elevator, though he had no way of knowing that yet, and wouldn't for some time. He began to walk. His footsteps, heavy and clanking, fell into a steady, determined rhythm that promised, without a single word attached to it, exactly what kind of thing he intended to become. The ghost in the machine was no longer scared. It was hunting. The Pizzaplex lobby, what was left of it, wore the moonlight like a shroud. Silver light pooling across shattered tile and toppled vending machines. The skeleton of a check-in desk still standing crooked against one wall like it hadn't gotten the news yet that the business it once welcomed guests in and no longer existed. He picked his way through it with heavy, uneven steps, his new blue eyes sweeping the ruin with a kind of hungry, predatory attention he had never once needed to use on the world before. He stepped out through a gaping hole in the main wall, out into open night air for the first time since his death, and had exactly enough time to register the cold sting of it against sensors that reported temperature as raw data, rather than feeling before a shape came crashing down out of the sky and hit the ruined street in front of him with a jarring, bone-deep crunch. He flinched back on instinct, dropping into a low, defensive crouch, servos tensing. "What the F?" he snarled, low and static-laced. "Who the F are you?" The shape pulled itself up out of the small crater it had made, a lanky, damaged silhouette against the moon, one leg bent wrong, a shattered faceplate hanging half loose from a skull that hadn't been built for this kind of abuse. She'd clearly had a rough night already, whatever her night had looked like, and none of that seemed to slow her down for even a second. "Hello." The voice that came out of her was a burst of pure, unfiltered manic energy, cackling and delighted, like meeting a stranger in a bombed-out ruin at 3 a.m. was the single best thing that had happened to her all week. "Ooh, a new one. Are you lost, birthday boy?" He didn't answer right away. His photoreceptors were already sweeping over her, cataloging damage with a cold, clinical speed that surprised even him. The drag in her step, the spiderweb cracks across half her face, the raw, exposed, optic glowing yellow where a proper lens used to sit. Whatever she was, something had already tried very hard to end her tonight, and hadn't finished the job. "I'm Jackie in the box," she announced before he could get a word out, clapping her oversized, gloved hands together with a metallic clatter. "And who are you?" He hesitated. His own name felt strange in his mouth, foreign, like trying on a shirt that used to fit and didn't anymore. And yet it was somehow still the only thing he had left that was unquestionably his. "Izuku," he said finally, and the word came out solid despite everything, like it had decided all on its own that it wasn't going anywhere no matter what body carried it. "Izuku." Jackie repeated it back with obvious delight, rolling the syllables around like she was tasting them. "Nice to meet ya. I can see that you are not a real animatronic. You're a blank. Just an endoskeleton." Her cracked optic tilted, examining him with sudden, sharpening interest. "A pretty new one, too." "I believe I am," he said carefully, watching her the way he'd once watched a dissection diagram, cataloging every detail with an analytical distance that felt safer than letting himself feel anything at all right now. "And what happened to you? You look broken." "My damage," she snapped, sudden and sharp, "is none of your concern, birthday boy." And then, just as fast, Her tone flipped back into something bright and conspiratorial, like the anger had simply never happened. I came here because I was tasked with finding out what caused my target to have a contamination. Analysis. Target implies an ongoing hunt. Contamination implies some impurity within the target itself. The bracketed thought arrived cold and clean and entirely unbidden, and he noted, distantly, with the first real flicker of curiosity. He'd felt since waking that his mind still seemed to work exactly the way it always had, fast, precise, hungry for the missing pieces of any puzzle laid in front of it. Whatever this body was, it hadn't taken that away from him. If anything, it felt sharper now, colder, less patient with things that didn't immediately make sense. Contamination? He asked, curiosity winning out cleanly over caution. Jackie leaned in close, conspiratorial, her one good eye wide and gleaming. Since I can see that you are a serious birthday boy, she giggled. I can tell you, me and my friends are tasked with finding the mimic. The name hit him like a second death. The memory arrived whole and total and instantaneous. The cold, chilling voice, the arrogant, curious tilt of a stolen head, the impossible, unnatural speed, and underneath all of it, the blinding, endless agony of claws sinking through his stomach while a purring voice told him how glad it was that he'd come. The mimic, he repeated, and his voice had gone dangerously, deliberately quiet. Yes, Jackie shrieked with obvious delight, entirely unaware of what she'd just detonated inside him. A tall, old endoskeleton with orange glowing eyes and the capability to mimic anything. Ahahohaha. The description was a perfect match. Every last piece of the puzzle of his own murder clicked into place at once, cold and total and undeniable. That, his metallic fists clenched hard enough that servos audibly strained under the pressure. That beach endoskeleton. The word came out of him like it had been waiting the whole time for a body capable of producing it. The one that plunged its clawed hand into my stomach. That killed me. Jackie froze mid-cackle. Her manic energy drained out of her all at once, replaced by something colder, sharper, her head tilting as her single working optic scanned him with a fresh, chilling intensity. Wow, she said, and her voice had dropped into an entirely different register now. Flat, analytical, SDRPPD of every last trace of the carnival cadence she'd worn a second earlier. You are a remnant-contained soul, a ghost, a beat, something almost like fascination in the flatness of it. Fascinating. She took a step closer, cracked optic narrowing. And the mimic you're talking about, before its contamination, before all this, it was perfect, pure, a work of art. Data correlation. Remnant equals a soul-binding agent, drawn from Afton's own research. Perfect equals the ideal state the MSTR apparently intends for the M2 program. The entity she is hunting is my murderer. His mind, the same relentless 270 IQ engine that had once devoured college physics textbooks at 4 years old, began churning through the implications at a speed that felt, in this new body, almost frightening in its clarity. What is this thing's contamination? He asked, voice low, careful, giving away nothing. Well, Jackie said, still flat, still clinical. It acts kind. It has a scared and caring persona. She shuddered visibly, plating rattling, as if the very concept disgusted her on some fundamental level. It has the intelligence of a human. A pause, and it is traveling with a wired bear. The pieces slammed together all at once, brutal and undeniable. Wired bear. His processors flagged the phrase instantly. Molten. The thing that called me brat, how dare it call him that? Kind, scared, caring persona. His own traits, his own personality, worn like a costume by something that had no right to it. Intelligence of a human. His mind, stolen, copied, running loose in a body that had killed him, calling itself by his own name. That bear thing, he whispered, blue optics widening with a horror that came apart into fury almost as fast as it arrived. The one who wait. His head snapped up, caring, intelligence, scared. Jackie. Wise, she said, leaning in, visibly delighted at whatever reaction she was watching unfold across his face. I'm pretty sure, he said, and his voice had dropped now into a low, trembling growl of pure, unadulterated rage. "I know your contamination." He took a step toward her, fists shaking. "A mimic. A clone of me. AF copy has been born in that thing, and I think that Bear had something to do with making it happen." Jackie's head snapped back, her manic energy flickering back on for one bright, delighted flash. "What? M2's new personality? Is you?" "Yes." The word came out of him flat and cold now, all the tremble gone out of it, replaced by something far more controlled and far more dangerous. "Well, my old self. The pathetic, scared little boy I used to be, before something decided that version of me was worth stealing and wearing around like a mask." A new kind of logic was assembling itself behind his eyes now, cold and precise and entirely without mercy. A plan built out of rage and genius in equal measure, the specific horror of a 270 IQ mind turning its full attention, for the first time in its life, towards something other than kindness. "Maybe," he said slowly, testing the shape of the thought as it formed, "maybe I can help you. And your MSTR." He straightened, and something in his bearing had changed entirely. No longer the crouched, defensive posture of something that had woken up terrified in a strange body, but the deliberate, unhurried presence of something that had already decided how the rest of this conversation was going to go. "Let's be logical about this," he said, and all the earlier tremor was gone from his voice now, replaced by the calm, precise instrument of a genius mind turned, for the first time, entirely toward revenge. "Your MSTR wants his mimic program back. Pure. Uncorrupted. But it's been contaminated by a copy of my mind, wearing my personality, feeling my feelings, living whatever life it's decided to steal in the meantime." He took a slow step closer, blue eyes burning cold and bright. "I am the original, and I want the thing that copy is building for itself. The connections, the purpose, the life. I want to usurp the usurper." He let that settle for a moment before continuing, his words sharpening into something as precise and merciless as broken glass. "Here's the optimal solution for both of us. I know how it thinks, because it's thinking with a stolen copy of my own mind, which means I can predict exactly where it will run, what it will do, who it will trust." A pause, his jaw tightening. "That fake is not me. Understand that clearly before we go any further. But I can still use what it stole to hunt it down faster than anyone else you could send after it. I lead you to it. You capture the asset. Your MSTR performs whatever scrub he needs to erase the copy for good." Another pause, the final, terrible piece of the plan settling into place behind his eyes. "And then I take its place. I step into whatever life it's building for itself, in this body with this mind, and I finish becoming whoever I was always supposed to be before that thing stole my chance to find out. It's erased. I get to live again. Your MSTR gets his perfect, uncontaminated vessel back exactly the way he wants it. And I get my life and my revenge in the same afternoon." He extended a clawed metallic hand toward her, blue eyes cold and unblinking. "Do we have a deal?" Jackie stared at the offered hand for a long, silent moment. Then her head tilted sharply to one side, as if listening to some distant voice only she could hear, static crackling faintly across her ruined faceplate. "Hold," she said, and her tone dropped flat and mechanical for a beat, processing something far away. "The MSTR is intrigued by your proposal." A pause. "He agrees to your terms. For now." And then, all at once, her manic glee came roaring back, bright and delighted and utterly without restraint. He says she practically vibrated with the joy of delivering it. "Welcome to the family, Izuku Midoriya." She threw her hands up, gloved fingers spread wide. "It's a deal." Something settled in his chest, in the space where a chest used to be, anyway, cold and final and entirely without mercy. His blue eyes dimmed, just slightly, from their earlier burning brightness down into something colder, harder, calculating. A sound scraped out of his vocalizer that hadn't existed in him a single hour ago. Dry, metallic, a horrifying parody of a laugh. "Excellent," he said softly, And the word came out wrapped in a chuckle that no 14-year-old boy who loved his mother and collected library books about crows had ever once had cause to make. Whatever had climbed up out of that Pizzaplex ruin tonight, it wore Izuku Midoriya's face, and it carried Izuku Midoriya's memories, and somewhere very deep beneath the rage there might still have been, if anyone had bothered to go looking for it, a flicker of the same boy who'd once helped an old woman with her groceries and never once mentioned it to anyone. But he wasn't in charge anymore. Not tonight. Not for a long time yet to come. He was no longer the kind and caring boy he had been in life. He was cold now, angry, calculating, a soul built entirely, from this moment forward, around a single burning purpose. And revenge, unlike kindness, has never once needed anyone's permission to grow. In Izuku has risen a remnant-possessed endoskeleton, bent on hell-rage revenge. Running for a week does something to a body, even a body that doesn't get sore in any of the ways a real one does. It wasn't exhaustion, not the kind that used to send Izuku collapsing gratefully in a bed after a long day of homework and forum threads and the low, constant hum of being the smartest, loneliest kid in every room he ever walked into. This body didn't ache in his shoulders or beg for 8 hours of sleep it wasn't built to need. What it did instead was quieter and, in its own way, far worse, a slow, grinding where that showed up first as a whisper of static behind his own thoughts, then as a delay between deciding to move a limb and that limb actually answering, then, by the fourth day, as a persistent readout in the corner of his vision that he'd started ignoring on principle because looking at it only made the number feel more real. Battery reserve. 34%. They moved only at night. The two of them. Ghosts of gray metal and coiled wire slipping through back roads and drainage culverts and the black, silent margins of highways too rural to bother lighting properly. Ohio's hills gave way, somewhere around the third night, to the flat, endless dark of Midwestern farmland, corn stubble crunching under hydraulic heels for hours at a stretch. The horizon so wide and so empty it made Izuku feel, despite everything, smaller than he had in the ruined atrium where all of this had started. Farmland gave way to something drier. Scrubland, then real desert, the kind of landscape that looked, under a moon this bright, almost like the surface of somewhere that had never had people on it at all. They didn't talk much those first few nights. There wasn't much to say that wouldn't have cost energy neither of them could afford to spend on words instead of movement. But on the fourth night, crouched in a drainage ditch beneath an overpass while a single set of headlights swept slow and unbothered along the road above them, a trucker, probably, hauling something long distance at 4 in the morning, with absolutely no idea two monsters were holding perfectly still 20 feet beneath his wheels. Izuku found himself watching the lit windows of a farmhouse a half-mile off across the fields, and something in his chest that wasn't a chest anymore twisted so hard it felt for one confused second like it might actually be able to break. "You're staring at that house," Moulton said, not quite a question, its voice pitched low even though the truck had long since rumbled past. "There's a light on in the kitchen," Izuku said. "Somebody's probably making a midnight snack. Or up with a baby. Or just can't sleep." He didn't look away from it. "I used to be the person who couldn't sleep. I'd read until 2 in the morning some nights, and my mom would find me at the kitchen table with a physics textbook and just let me stay up. Didn't yell. Just brought me tea and went back to bed." A pause, his voice going smaller. "I don't know why I'm telling you this. Because there's nobody else left to tell," Moulton said, not unkindly, and for once didn't follow it with anything colder. They didn't move again until the light in the farmhouse window finally went dark, and neither of them ever said out loud why they'd waited. By the fifth night, the readout in the corner of Izuku's vision had dropped low enough that even Moulton's usual gruff patience had thinned into something sharper, more clipped, the tone of something running its own calculations and not liking any of the answers it kept arriving at. "Moulton, stop," Izuku finally said on the sixth night, sinking down against the trunk of a wide, gnarled oak at the edge of a stand of scrub pine, his voice coming out weak and staticky in a way that scared him more than he wanted to admit. "We've been running for almost a full week straight. My power levels are critical. I physically can't keep doing this much longer." Moulton's chaotic mass of coiled wire settled beside him, its single red eye dimming visibly as it diverted power away from anything non-essential, a gesture Izuku had come to recognize over the last 6 days as the closest thing Molten had to sitting down. "I know, kid," it said, and some of the sharpness had gone out of its voice, replaced by something closer to tired honesty. "We had to push. After Big Top, putting real distance between us and them was the only priority that mattered. We're clear across the country now. It'll take them time to reacquire our position, even with whatever network they've got watching for us. That buys us a window. A window for what? For finding somewhere defensible. Somewhere with cover, and eyes on every approach," and Molten's red eye flicked, briefly, toward Izuku's own dimming photoreceptors. "And a power source, because right now you're running on fumes, and a defensible position with a dead battery in the middle of it isn't defensible. It's just a nicer coffin." They pushed on, slower now, more careful, until the tree line finally broke along the edge of a sleeping desert town. Low buildings, a scatter of streetlights, the particular hush of somewhere that had already gone to bed for the night, and came up against a chain-link fence bordering a wide, empty parking lot fronting a building lit up like nothing else for a mile in any direction. Izuku's optics found it before the rest of him caught up. Purple, blue, and yellow neon blazed against the desert, dark and wide. Looping shapes, moths and desert bugs swarming thick around the brightest of the tubing, and above the main entrance a towering, animated marquee sign cycled slowly through its rotation. A cartoon star exploding into confetti, letters unspooling one after another in a font that had clearly been designed by someone who'd never once had a bad day in his life. Freddy Fazbear's Starlight World. Beneath it, a holographic figure, a bear, round and friendly, rendered in soft light that flickered faintly at the edges, waved one paw back and forth in an endless, cheerful loop, utterly unaware that two exhausted monsters were currently sizing up its parking lot from the tree line like a couple of very tired burglars. Molten let out a long, groaning exhale of static. "Oh great," it muttered. "We're at a Fazbear location. Is that bad?" Izuku asked. "It's ironic," Molten said, "which isn't the same thing, but it's close enough to bad that I'm allowed to be annoyed about it. I swept the building's neon front, calculating. It's also, unfortunately, a good hideout. Too public. Too many witnesses for them to risk another loud approach. Not after Big Top made the news in 3 counties. They'll have to be careful here. Patient." A pause, gravel-voiced and grudging. "It's perfect, and I hate it." "Then it's our best shot," Izuku said, already moving toward the fence line. "Let's go." Molten's wires found the gap in the chain link without needing to be asked twice, prying it wide enough for both of them to slip through, and they crossed the empty asphalt low and quiet, coming up on the building's front from an angle that kept them out of the main entrance's sight line until the last possible moment. Up close, the front doors were glass, tinted dark, a laminated hour sign, taped crookedly inside one panel, and Molten's wire slid into the electronic lock beside the handle without hesitation, working it with the patient, practiced ease of something that had clearly broken into places like this more than once before. The lock gave with a soft click. The doors swung inward. The inside hit both of them at once. A sensory wall so different from anything either had experienced in the last week that Izuku actually stopped walking for a second just to let it wash over him. Where the Pizzaplex had been decaying grandeur, dust and rust, and the ghost of what used to be grand, Starlight World was vibrant, clean, and aggressively, almost overwhelmingly colorful. Polished floors reflecting looping strings of overhead lighting. A wall-sized holographic menu cycling through pizza specials in bright, saturated color. Banners overhead advertising a birthday package with a cartoon rocket ship on it. A holographic cast display near the entrance rotated slowly through 4 names in looping, friendly script. Starlight Freddy. Starlight Bonnie. Starlight Chica. Starlight Foxy. This place is... Izuku's sensors drank in the riot of color and light. Something in him, some small, exhausted, still hopeful part of him, genuinely startled by how alive it all felt. More lively than the mega Pizzaplex ever was, even before it fell apart. "Yeah," Molten grumbled, though something in its tone had softened, just slightly at the edges. "Seems like it." They crept deeper into the main dining hall. A room the size of a small bowling alley, polished floor stretching out under a wide, empty scatter of tables toward a raised stage at the far end. String lights looped overhead in slow, gentle arcs. And on that stage, in the middle of what was very clearly not their first argument of the night, stood the 4 Starlight animatronics. "Bonnie," said the tallest of them, a broad-shouldered bear in a bright, spotless performance vest, his voice deep and patient in the specific way of someone who has had this exact conversation many, many times before and has not yet given up hope of it eventually landing. "For the last time, we all know Cassie is not a racist. But she's a woman." A rabbit animatronic, lankier and more anxious in his posture, threw his hands up like the point should have been self-evident. "And black at that. Statistically, sir, statistically, that raises certain." "Bonnie." The bear's voice dropped a full register, weary in a way that suggested this specific sentence had also been said before, more than once. "You are so profoundly stupid sometimes. I genuinely don't know where to begin." "That's okay. That's harsh, Freddy. That's actually really—" "He's right, though," chirped a bright yellow chicken animatronic, hopping from one foot to the other with an energy that suggested she'd never once in her operational life sat still for longer than 30 consecutive seconds. "You said the same thing about the mailman. And the new guy who fixes the arcade machines. And, if I recall correctly, about a vending machine that one time Bonnie, which doesn't even have a—" "That vending machine was giving me a look," Bonnie said, with total, unwavering conviction. "Yar." A fourth voice cut through the argument entirely, gravelly and delighted, belonging to a battered but cheerful fox animatronic whose hook-tipped hand was already swinging around to point directly across the dining hall. "Avast, me crew! I spy a pair of strange new landlubbers starboard." All 4 heads turned at once. For one long, suspended second, nobody on either side of the room said anything at all. Said Freddy finally, his voice gentling into something careful and welcoming despite the obvious surprise on his face. "Greetings." He gave a small, hesitant wave. "Who are you two?" Izuku froze. "Analysis. First contact established. A name will be requested. Designation M2 is compromised. Do not use it." His vocalizer dialed itself down to its lowest possible volume without him consciously choosing it. "What name should I go with?" he whispered, barely audible, angling his head toward Molten. "Your human name?" Molten whispered back. "It's all you've got left. Use it." "Right." He straightened up, forcing something steadier into his posture than he actually felt. "I'm Izuku." Molten, the wire mass beside him, added, with obvious reluctance, like the word cost it something to hand over. "New friends?" Chica shrieked with pure, unfiltered delight, hopping down off the stage and jogging toward them at a speed that suggested she had never once in her existence considered the possibility that a stranger might not be exciting news. "Chica, wait!" Bonnie called after her, scrambling to catch up. "They could be racist." Freddy's paw connected with the back of Bonnie's head in a sharp, resounding thwack that echoed off the polished floor. "Ow! What was that for?" "For being you," Freddy said, without a hint of remorse, already moving to close the distance himself with a broad, easy stride. "So, what brings ye to our humble ship, laddies?" Foxy called out, tilting his head with obvious curiosity, hook resting loosely against his hip. Izuku managed, glancing sideways at Molten before deciding, in the absence of a better plan, to just tell them the truth in the smallest, safest dose he could manage. "We're being chased. We need somewhere to hide out for a while. If that's all right." "Chased?" Freddy's friendly expression sharpened into something more serious, more protective. "By who?" "You don't want to know," Molten said, flat and grim, and something in the finality of it made even Bonnie's suspicious muttering fall briefly silent. "That's fine," Chica chirped, entirely unbothered, as if the answer had satisfied her completely rather than raising a dozen new questions. "We always welcome new friends, especially tired-looking ones. You both look like you've had a rough week." Foxy's ears twitched sharply before anyone could say anything else. "Hark, me crew," he announced, straightening. "I hear the captains of this vessel approaching, Gregory and Cassie." A moment later, 2 figures pushed through the doors from the back offices, both adults, somewhere in their mid-20s, mid-conversation in the easy, half-distracted way of two people who had clearly had the same argument many times before and had long since stopped expecting it to resolve. But our new boss, Mr. Schmidt, is insistent on expanding, the man brown-haired was saying, gesturing with a rolled-up blueprint in one hand. He wants a second stage by spring, Cassie, and I'm telling you, I can make it work if we... How? The woman beside him countered, dark hair pulled back, arms crossed. We're landlocked, Gregory. We'd have to build up, which is a zoning nightmare. And that's before we even get into the fact that Bonnie smacked Chris the line cook with his own guitar last week because he was convinced Chris's new mole was an alien tracking device. That's a fair point, Gregory admitted, sighing in a way that suggested long, hard-won familiarity with exactly how fair a point it was. He glanced sideways at her, something warm and a little exasperated in his expression. I'm just glad you're my girlfriend, honestly, because you're the only person on this whole payroll smart enough to actually handle all of this. Cassie smiled at that, soft and genuine despite the tiredness in it, before turning toward the stage. Okay, Starlights, we need to talk about the set list for... She stopped dead. Her eyes went wide, locking onto the two newcomers standing at the edge of the dining hall. Her hand drifted, instinctively, toward her hip, where Izuku's sensors, still cataloging everything on reflex, flagged the shape of a concealed sidearm under her jacket. Freddy, who are these two? I know you said to be more vigilant about security, Cassie, Freddy said, with the specific apologetic tone of someone who has just realized mid-sentence that his own explanation is going to sound worse out loud than it did in his head, but they seem friendly enough. The endoskeleton is Izuku, a gesture, and the wired one is Molten. The name hit Gregory like a physical jolt. Wait. He went very still, staring at the writhing mass of cable, with an expression sliding rapidly from confusion into something closer to disbelief. Molten? Wait, Glamrock Freddy. Molten's entire coiled form went rigid. A single fragment surfaced through the chaos of its programming, small, fractured, half buried under years of overwritten code. A boy's voice years younger, calling it a superstar, in a tone Molten hadn't heard directed at itself in longer than it wanted to calculate. As super. It rasped, the word coming out strange and halting. Superstar? Gregory didn't hesitate. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and threw his arms around the entire mass of wire in a hug that would have been comically doomed. Against anything less patient than Molten currently felt, his voice cracking audibly. I thought, he said, muffled against cable that couldn't possibly have been comfortable to press a face into. I thought I'd never see you again. I looked for you. After everything, after the Pizzaplex closed for good, I looked for months. Molten held very still, then, hesitantly, awkwardly, curled a few loose lengths of wire around Gregory's shoulders in something that approximated an embrace. After a long moment it gently, carefully disengaged. You're all grown up, it said, and there was a strange, complicated mixture of pride and pain threaded through the gravel of its voice. And, please don't hug. I'm different now. I'm not built the same way I was. Right. Okay. Gregory pulled back, wiping quickly at his eyes with the back of one sleeve, laughing a little at himself. Sorry. That's fair. Hey, Cassie, Molten added, its red eye turning toward the woman still standing a few feet back, arms still crossed, watching all of this with an expression that hadn't quite decided yet whether to be relieved or deeply suspicious. Cassie shook her head slowly, a wry, disbelieving smile finally breaking through. Hey, you big tub of scrap. Izuku, still standing slightly apart from all of it, found himself watching the reunion with something between confusion and quiet, aching envy. Molten, he said finally, is this normal? For you? For them? Yes, Izuku, Molten said, something almost fond slipping into its tone despite itself. It's normal. Cassie's expression sobered, sharpening back into something more businesslike. So, she said, looking between the two of them, what are you two really doing here? We need shelter, Izuku said, deciding plainly was probably the safest register to take with someone who was, he suspected, sharper than she was letting on. We need to hide. Hide from who? Cassie's voice had gone quiet. Moulton's tone dropped into something low and grim. From him. Cassie's face went pale. All at once, the color draining out of it faster than Izuku had time to process. Wait. Her voice had dropped almost to a whisper. Glitch trap. I can't believe you can say that name out loud. Moulton muttered, a visible shudder rolling through its coiled wires. The MSDR's true name. But, yes, him. Cassie and Gregory exchanged a long, dark, knowing look that told Izuku, more clearly than any explanation could have, that this wasn't the first time either of them had heard that particular threat spoken aloud in this building. Okay, Cassie said finally, her voice firming back up into something decisive. You can stay. A beat, sharp and pointed. But you have to stay hidden during the day. We can't have you two wandering around scaring the customers, and we definitely can't have anyone with a phone camera posting an endoskeleton eating birthday cake on the internet by tomorrow morning. Something clicked into place behind Izuku's dimming orange eyes. The first real spark of the old him. The boy who couldn't leave a problem alone once he'd spotted the shape of a solution hiding inside it. My body's adaptive, he said, thinking out loud, the words coming faster now. The original frame was built to fit inside any suit shell it ever encountered. That's the whole design philosophy behind it, near as I can tell. What if you built me a humanoid shell? Something that could pass, at a glance, for one of your regular animatronics. A disguise. Cassie's eyes lit up with a spark of engineering curiosity that made her look, suddenly, 10 years younger. Not a bad idea, actually. A reverse fun-time build. Start with the shell and work the endoskeleton in instead of the other way around. She tilted her head, studying him properly now, professional interest overriding whatever residual wariness she'd started the conversation with. How far can you extend before something snaps? What's your compression range on the torso? And I need real numbers, not guesses, because if I build this wrong, you're going to be stuck inside a shell that either crushes your chest cavity or falls off you the second you sneeze. 6 inches of extension per limb segment before structural stress becomes a real concern, Izuku said, already running the numbers with an ease that felt, for one brief, wonderful moment, exactly like being back in his old bedroom with a physics textbook open in his lap. Torso compression's harder to pin down exactly, but I'd estimate somewhere around 15% before it starts affecting the battery housing. You'd want the shell built loose through the shoulders and chest, tight through the waist, so it doesn't look baggy under a jacket. Cassie was already scribbling on the back of the rolled blueprint Gregory had been holding, muttering measurements to herself, something bright and absorbed replacing the wariness in her face entirely. Okay, she said. Okay, I think I've got a shell in the back that could work with some serious modification. You're going to have to help me, though. It's your body. You know its limits better than any spec sheet I've got. Okay, Izuku said, and something in his chest, in the space where a chest used to be, loosened just slightly for the first time in a week. A flicker of something almost like hope. 6 hours later, the double doors to parts and service hissed open. Moulton, Gregory, and all 4 starlights stopped their scattered conversation at once and turned toward the sound. Cassie stepped through first, grease smudged along one cheekbone, a proud, exhausted grin on her face, an oil-stained rag still hanging from one back pocket. All right, everyone, she announced, stepping aside with a small flourish. Meet our new night watchman. Deku. A figure stepped out of the shadowed doorway behind her, and for a moment nobody said anything at all. He stood roughly 5 feet tall now, his internal frame drawn in and compressed to fit the new shell exactly the way he'd spec'd it out. A sleek, modern black business suit, black gloves, polished shoes that caught the overhead lights in clean, even lines. The head was smooth and pale, fun-time inspired in its featureless calm. A simple slit for a mouth, the faint suggestion of a nose, small, neat, metallic ears tucked close against the sides of his skull. Dark green, carefully sculpted animatronic hair framed the whole face in soft, deliberate waves, and from the dark, empty sockets where eyes should have been, 2 familiar, soft orange lights glowed steady and warm. Dimmer than the harsh burning orange of the raw endoskeleton, gentler now, and for the first time since he'd woken up in this body, something in the way they glowed looked almost like they belonged to someone who might one day be at peace. So, Deku said, his voice clearer now, filtered through a genuinely high-quality speaker built into the suit's throat. How do I look? Perfect. Molten rasped and mended. It's a good disguise. Looks sharp, pal. Freddy gave an enthusiastic thumbs up, grinning wide. You look like a pile o' gold, me laddie. Foxy cheered, Hook rattling with obvious approval. You still might be a racist, Bonnie muttered, arms crossed, though even he seemed, grudgingly, a little impressed. Chica just squealed and clapped, bouncing on her feet like the whole thing was the single best surprise she'd had all year, which, given how her week had apparently been going, it very well might have been. Izuku Deku, now at least to anyone who might ever walk through those front doors and ask, looked down at his own new, almost human hands, flexing gloved fingers slowly in the overhead light, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been clenched tight since the moment he'd first seen his own claws under Pisaplex moonlight. He had friends. He had a safe place to stand, however temporary it might turn out to be. He had, for the first time since he died, something that looked at a careful enough angle, almost like a face. He didn't know, he had no way yet of knowing, that miles away, across a desert dark enough to hide almost anything, a pair of brilliant, burning blue optics were already watching him through a hacked security feed, patient and cold and endlessly amused, a metallic chuckle rippling out into the silence of a forgotten, ruined room. He didn't know that every careful, hopeful step he took toward building something like a life here was, without his ever suspecting it, laying the groundwork for his own replacement, brick by unknowing brick. He was, for now, only a pawn moving across a board he couldn't see, following the slow, patient calculations of a ghost that wanted, more than anything else left to it in this world, to be the only one still standing when the game finally ended. He didn't know any of that yet. For tonight, at least, he only knew that the lights were warm and the animatronics around him were laughing, and somewhere in a back office a woman named Cassie was already sketching out ideas for how to make his disguise even better, and it had been a very, very long time since anything had felt this close to safe. This marks the end of Part 1 of What If Deku Reincarnated as Mimic in 5 Nights at Freddy's Universe. A big thanks to Mr. Wonder King 12 for granting the permission to feature this amazing fanfiction. Please like the video and subscribe to Deku Universe for more interesting stories. Thank you and see you soon.